Chapter 296. It took Odom quite a bit of effort to catch the little girl who was dangling in the air. Odom's face was stern and his thick eyebrows were almost knitted together. He kept grumbling that she was too daring and didn't care about the danger at all, and that she had caused a lot of trouble for an old man like him. But in the end Odom still asked, "Little one, are you hurt anywhere?" "Ah." Descending from midair, little Roman patted his chest the moment his feet touched the ground. He exhaled deeply and said happily, "That's right. That was really dangerous." However, there was no trace of danger on her face. Instead, her little face was flushed red, and she had an excited expression on her face. Odom glanced at her and thought to himself, "So you know that it was dangerous." However, his next words were stuck in his throat as he heard Romain say excitedly, "How interesting." Odom's expression turned serious when he heard that and lectured her. "Little girl, it's not good to think that way. It's too dangerous. If I didn't come over, wouldn't you have been injured?" "Old man, you came over," the Roman replied as if it was a matter of fact. Odom scratched his head and thought that there was something wrong with that statement. So he continued to persuade her. "That's just in case. There's also what if, isn't there? Besides, little girl, what you're doing is causing a lot of trouble for an old man like me. Let's not talk about how you're delaying this old man's drinking time. My aunt says it's not good for your health to drink too much." The merchant girl took the opportunity to interject. The old dwarf suddenly felt a headache coming on. Why was this little girl's way of thinking so different from ordinary people? He began to wonder if it was a wise decision to save this little girl. Perhaps he should have pretended that he did not see anything and went back to drinking his wine. No, perhaps he should not have even raised his head. Odom was a little annoyed and quickly waved his hand. "That's not what we're talking about. Besides, a dwarf who doesn't drink can't be called a dwarf. Little guy, your aunt." The old dwarf thought for a moment and felt that it was not honorable to speak ill of someone behind their back, not to mention that the other party was a woman. So he changed his tune and said, "Anyway, one thing is another. You see, a normal person wouldn't swing around in the alley behind the inn while holding the bedsheets, right?" The old dwarf instructed. However, he subconsciously felt that there was something wrong with his words. But after thinking about it carefully, he couldn't find where the problem was. He could only shake his head and throw this strange thought away. But in his heart, he secretly thought that the good time of drinking in the afternoon seemed to be getting further and further away from him, because the little girl had started chattering again. However, Odom did not realize that he had been diverted to her way of thinking, and it was up to her to use her rich experience to defeat the old dwarf. Roman thought for a while and nodded. "You're right." But she frowned her pretty little eyebrows. "But Roman has no choice. I'm also in a hurry to go to the mines." The old dwarf was stunned. "Why are you going to the mines?" he asked. "Women aren't allowed to enter the mines." "Because the person Roman likes is in the mines. There's an earthquake in the mines, and the Roman is very anxious." She looked at the dwarf and suddenly blinked. "Oh right. Old man, can you bring Roman to the mines? You don't know the way." Odom's little eyes were wide open. "Think so." She didn't seem to realize that this was a serious problem. It was obvious that she had once again committed the mistake of acting first and thinking later. Before she was ready to do this, she had already forgotten all the embarrassing things that had happened to her when she was young. There's a saying that a person can't make the same mistake twice in a lifetime, but our merchant lady clearly had the ability to make two identical mistakes in a variety of ways. But this time Odom laughed. Of course, it was more accurate to say that the old dwarf was laughing out loud. He laughed heartily, laughing so hard that he almost fell down. As he laughed, he mumbled, "How interesting, how interesting. This is the first time I've heard of such a reckless plan. Even the most reckless mountain dwarves can't do this, little girl. Even the clumsy beastmen have to plan thoroughly before they hunt." The Roman agreed. "Because the beastmen have a saying, snemont." She stuttered as she read out the saying. "It means that a smart hunter might not be smart. That's just a beast's cunning." The old dwarf immediately shook his head. "No, who taught you that?" "It was my aunt." No. Odom felt that he had been tricked. "What I mean is, these two things don't match at all. We're saying that a person shouldn't be too rash, and it has nothing to do with beastmen being smart." He stroked his beard and suddenly frowned. Wait, what did you just say? There's an earthquake in the mines? Yes. Why didn't I know about it? The Roman looked at him with her big eyes. The old dwarf immediately realized that he had asked a silly question. But if the earthquake happened an hour ago, he should have been taking a nap then. In fact, Odom should have been in the mines, but he had missed the time to enter the mines because he was drunk. It was not the first time, but the old dwarf had helped the clerk of the mines solve some personal problems and won the young noble's trust. As for whether he had to work in the mines or not, the young noble did not care. There was no problem with having one more person or one less person in the mines. That was why Odom was too lazy to go to the mines and came to the trout in the forest for a drink. That was his goal as a dwarf. However, the little girl's words had piqued his interest. The old dwarf had always known that there was a secret hidden in the mines, and he had come here to wait for an opportunity after he found out about it. But what disappointed him was that ever since the workers of Schaflund mine dug through the tunnels that led to the Great Beehive and caused an accident, the tunnels no longer extended downwards, and the secret hidden in the Greyhar Mountains could only stay there quietly. Although the old dwarf had asked Perkins more than once if he could reopen the 5th level of mining, it was always put on hold due to safety concerns. The young clerk wasn't worried about the safety of the workers, but rather, he didn't want to cause any trouble for himself. But as time passed, Odom gradually became disheartened after coming to Schaflund for a few years. But at this time his heart was moved again. The old dwarf muttered in his heart and looked at the little girl. All right, I'll bring you to the mines, but let me say this first. I understand. Little Roman replied in an extremely straightforward manner, without the slightest bit of sloppiness. But I'm not done yet. Yes, but I'll give the same answer no matter what you say, old man. So it doesn't matter if it's earlier or later. You're a frank one. The old dwarf sighed. But you're quite likable. Looking at the little Roman girl, Odom could not help but think of the lively little girls back in his hometown. He grew up among the golden dwarves when he was young, and although his hometown was not as novel and varied as the humans, and they did not have excellent winemaking techniques, the dwarven girls were much more lively than the human girls. But this little girl made his eyes light up. Although he had a headache, she was to his liking. Of course she was to his liking, but the old dwarf knew that if he let her do as she pleased, she would cause a lot of trouble for him. So he said as he walked, in any case, the 3 rules are very important. Do you understand, little girl? The little Roman nodded respectfully, but she immediately had a new question. But didn't you say that women can't enter the mines? Don't interrupt, little girl. Odom frowned. He obviously could not bring the Roman into the mines openly. In fact, even he could not enter the mines himself. But it did not matter. He had prepared for a long time for this plan, and some of the arrangements he had made beforehand could be put to good use. He had dug a secret tunnel outside the mines that led to the mines. Since he was the supervisor of the mines, no one would suspect anything if they bumped into him. As for the little girl, it was a little troublesome, but it was just a matter of putting on makeup. Yes, Romain followed up and asked. But old man, are the mountain dwarfs also rash? Old man, are you a mountain dwarf as well? Of course I'm not a mountain dwarf. Those rash fellows have nothing to do with me. I'm... The short and fat dwarf suddenly stopped and coughed heavily. Don't interrupt. Oh, the battle underground had come to an end. When the last rock beast was reduced to pieces, Brando found a few corpses of miners at the end of the tunnel. After the man identified them, he realized that they were the corpses of his former companions. After the miner who was saved by Brando saw the young man's strength, he was determined to follow them. Even when Brando advised him to hide in the safer 3rd level of the mine, the latter shook his head and refused. He felt that it was much safer to follow the 2 of them. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 297. In fact, there was almost no loot from the previous battle. The EXP he gained was just some experience points. In fact, Brando found that he didn't gain much from killing monsters below the level of Black Iron. To be exact, monsters below level 15. This was exactly the same as his experience in the game. But he found a ring in the wreckage, an ogre ring. In the amber sword, equipment with the prefix ogre could increase the wearer's strength. In fact, this was a series of equipment with a wide range of levels ranging from level 20 to 70. The lower ones were titled ghouls, while the higher ones were mostly prefixed with dragons. This ogre ring was the lowest of the bunch at level 20, but it was far beyond Brando's imagination. In the game, there was less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that a level 15 monster would drop a level 20 magic item. Of course, the highest level on the list was a level 25 armor, which only had a 1 in 10,000 chance, or in the player's words, it was basically zero. But with Brendel's usual unlucky hand, he could not help but look at Scarlet a few more times when he received the ring. Could she also be the holder of the legendary Lucky Hand halo? Brando checked the attributes. The ogre ring increased the wearer's strength by 5%. Brando's strength was 73.4 ounces, and because of the implanted Ghost Knight's crystal and power burst, his strength was close to 100 ounces. This thing could increase his strength by about 5 ounces, which was better than nothing. But he already had the Ring of the Wind Empress, the Ring of Flame, the Ring of Secondary Snake, and the Ring of Warrior on his hand. Brando thought for a moment and was too lazy to change, so he simply threw the ring to the red-haired girl behind him. Scarlet took the ring and was slightly stunned. "I don't have any strength again," she whispered, a little puzzled. "That's only temporary," Brando replied. "It won't be long before you recover." "Really?" Her amber eyes suddenly lit up. Brando looked back at the girl, slightly silent, but finally nodded. "When have I ever lied to anyone? Of course it's true." Scarlet's face revealed an extremely happy expression. However, this red-haired young lady had a sharp sense that was unique to females. She sensed Brando's hesitation. She thought for a moment, blinked her eyes and said, "Is it related to the blood of God, sir?" Brando nodded. "Actually, it's nothing." Scarlet wasn't worried at all. She smiled. "Compared to becoming a monster, I'm more worried about losing my power. At least then, I can still fight for my lord." "Sure." Brando put a finger to his lips and gestured to the back. The miner still followed them at a distance, and of course, did not hear what was said between them. Scarlet nodded and put the ring on her index finger. She was so careful, as if she was protecting a treasure. "Actually, you don't have to be so careful. This thing isn't worth much. It's just a magic item." Brando couldn't help but remind him. But Scarlet smiled and replied, "Yes, but as a gift, the meaning is very different." Brando was stunned. The young lady had already changed the topic. She looked at the surrounding rock walls and asked in a low voice, "Sir, do you think the earthquake has anything to do with these monsters?" Brando nodded. "Did the earthquake cause these monsters to appear from underground?" Scarlet asked again. "I'm afraid it's the opposite." "The opposite?" The mercenary was slightly stunned. "How can such weak monsters cause an earthquake?" "Weak?" Brando shook his head. "That was only temporary. If this quest really involved a silver legacy, then it was hard to say what they would encounter later on." With this thought in mind, they gradually went deeper into the fourth layer of the mine. Soon Brando found Mahan's corpse at a corner. Not far from the left side of the supervisor were two incomplete rock leopards. There were obvious sword wounds on their bodies that killed them. It was obvious that Mahan had fought with these beasts when he was alive, but he could not escape death in the end. Brando checked the man's wounds. The fatal wound was on his neck. According to his judgment, Mahan should be at least at the level of a black iron, but the wound left behind by the attacker was very clean. It was obviously a one-hit kill. For this to work, the attacker's strength must be far greater than the victim's. This meant that there were more powerful monsters here. Brando was not the only one who saw this. Scarlet also saw this. She did not say a word, but her face became solemn. When the miner saw the supervisor's corpse, he trembled and fell to the ground. He was scared out of his wits. In his mind, these foremen were usually high and mighty existences, but when they turned into cold corpses, it made him feel like he could die at any time. He almost lost control of his emotions and could not help but scream. Brando had no choice but to use the secondary snake ring to paralyze him, so that he would not attract more monsters. It was not easy to wait for the miner to calm down before they could continue moving forward. Brando observed the surroundings and decisively chose a tunnel to the north. If he remembered correctly, this should be the place where he separated from Cohen and the others. But this time, the three of them did not move for long before two groups of rock leopards surrounded them from all directions. These rock beasts quietly came from the shadows, and there seemed to be more and more of them. Brando used two of his swords, but he gradually began to realize that these rock leopards seemed to be endless. Scarlet seemed to have noticed this at the same time. She whispered from behind, "My lord, we have to find a way to leave this place." Brando nodded, but his plan was slightly different from the mercenary girls. He knew that if it was a normal person here, they could only sit and wait for death. And if it was a mercenary with some ability, they would probably make the same choice as Scarlet. But he was different. He was a player. Continuously killing monsters like this was an extremely abnormal phenomenon in the game. He immediately calmed down and based on his experience, he looked for the leader hidden among the low-level monsters. Sure enough, he soon saw a cat with a smooth surface like black jade flash through the darkness. Although it was only a glimpse, Brando could already tell that it was at least a mid-level iron rank. It was not black jade, but obsidian. This was the guy he was looking for. The young man immediately slashed the small fries blocking the way and took the lead to chase after it. But what surprised Brando was that when he showed hostility, the thing's reaction was shockingly fast. Before he could swing his sword, the black leopard had already turned around and disappeared into the darkness. The obsidian rock leopard's speed was extremely fast, even far exceeding its strength. Brando's charge skill had not even begun to charge, but the creature had already disappeared without a trace after turning a corner. It was not just the beast. Brando immediately noticed that the low-level rock leopards around him retreated like the tide. He stopped in shock, but the monsters around him suddenly disappeared without a trace. What's going on? Brando did not think that it was because of his overbearing aura that scared the monsters away. Elemental creatures did not have emotions at all. They only had the basic ability to make logical judgments. The mine tunnel became empty. What was that? Scarlet and the miner saw the monster that disappeared in a flash. When Brando stopped, they immediately chased after him and asked, "Leader?" Brando replied. Leader refers to the leader of a group of monsters, but here it is the summoner's eyes. The same goes for elven messengers, beast summoners, and even necromancers. No matter how powerful a spellcaster is, they can't control an entire army by themselves. They need lower-level spies to control those summoned creatures that only have the lowest intelligence. For example, low-level necromancers and skeletons. It's the same here. He pointed to the depths of the mine tunnel and said, "But I don't know how big this summoning network is. If the black jade-like leopard is the highest level of this network, then it's easy to deal with. What if it's not? Then it's troublesome," Brando said as he walked deeper into the tunnel. But Scarlet seemed to be a little worried. She felt that everything underground was strange. Although this lord seemed to know what was going on, she did not like the feeling of being shrouded in the unknown. She thought for a moment and could not help but say, "My lord, let's go back to the third level first. Isn't our goal to find the guard captain and take control of the silver mine? Why do we have to make things difficult for these monsters here?" Brando shook his head. "It was like that at first, but Scarlet, it's different now." "Different again?" Scarlet was stunned. Brando nodded. The value of a silver legacy was much higher than the entire silver mine. It was like using a gold mine to exchange with Brando's golden apple. Brando would never do such a stupid thing. But he did not explain much and walked deeper into the tunnel. But before he took 2 steps, he made a soft sound of surprise. "What's wrong?" Scarlet asked from behind. "Come and take a look at this," Brendel said as he turned the corner. The red-haired girl limped forward with the help of the lightning spear. But as soon as she turned the corner, she was stunned. Behind the corner was a vast space, but at this moment, it was as if a terrible storm had happened here. To be more precise, under the dim light of the illuminating crystal, there were pieces of the rock leopard in the mine. There were even some black jade-like pieces scattered among the gray rocks. Needless to say, these were the remains of another kind of monster. Brando raised his head and looked into the depths of the cave. "It seems that someone got here before us. A powerful guy," he said. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation to be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Chapter 298. The underground world was shrouded in boundless darkness, and the long tunnel was silent. The only sound that could be heard was the sound of the underground water seeping into the rock layer above and dripping to the ground. This kind of voice only rang out once in a long time in the depths of the abyss where one couldn't even see one's own fingers. Medisha had to stop and rest after driving away a large number of uninvited guests from the underground. Even though she was a ghost, it did not mean that she did not know fatigue. The activity of the soul fire restricted the movement of undead creatures to a certain extent. However, she didn't need any light. In the darkness, a faint fluorescent light was hidden in her pupils, allowing her to see very far in the dark. The silver fairy princess did not sit down, but leaned against the wall to rest with her spear in one hand. Her body was surrounded by the fragments of the rock leopard, and these incomplete corpses were scattered far away. Unlike Brando, she was attacked almost as soon as she entered this level. She had killed a bloody path to reach this place. After a moment of silence, the silver fairy princess asked the other side of the darkness, "Is there an elevator here?" Medisha was not alone in the darkness. The only sound came from the other side of the tunnel. "Yes," that voice replied. But Medisha was not at ease. Just as she finished speaking, she put her hand on her spear and looked in the direction she came from. But just as she turned her head, her face lit up with joy and she shouted, "My lord!" It was Brando and Scarlet who came. They raised the illuminating crystals in their hands and shone the light in their direction. When they saw Medisha, they were not too surprised. They had followed the traces left by the silver elf princess all the way here. Brando was not too surprised when he discovered that the so-called powerful person might be Medisha. There were only a few of them in the underground, and if it was not the silver elf princess, Coden, and even Yuta did not have the strength to do so. But when they saw the other person in the illuminated area, they were stunned. "Medisha?" Brando asked. "This is..." He looked at Coden, who was sitting on the ground without saying a word. He was a little confused. The previously majestic old man was now in a sorry state. His forehead, face, and blue-gray uniform were covered in blood, and his gray hair was a mess. "Mr. Coden is injured," Medisa replied. This elven princess was smart enough to stop there, but there were still many things that she did not say out loud. But she knew that Brando would understand what she meant. The old man snorted. "I am a captive, what is there to hide?" But this little girl saw that my old bones still have some use, so she signed a non-aggression agreement. "But she's very respectful to you, boy. She said that the final decision is in your hands. My lord. Tell me, do you want me to kill you or cut you up?" Although he said that, he couldn't help but curse the fairy princess for being so cunning. When the tunnel collapsed, everyone's first reaction was to protect themselves. It was as if it was an instinct to save their own lives. Even gold-ranked existences like them were no exception. But Coden didn't expect that not everyone present was a living being. When the landslide happened, Medisha's first reaction was not to retreat to a safe place, but to attack him while the rocks were falling. This was a suicidal attack. Even someone as calm as Coden couldn't help but jump in fright. However, a battle between gold-ranked existences could be decided in the blink of an eye. Although Coden was much stronger than Medisha, he had used all his strength to chase after Brando, and he wasn't prepared for the landslide. In the end, he was heavily injured by Medisha. In the end, if it wasn't for this little girl pulling him out of the rubble, he would have died in the mine. But even so, he couldn't help but admire Medisha's courage. If it was him in that situation, he wouldn't have made the same choice. No matter what the reason was, Coden, as a veteran soldier, had nothing to say about being defeated on the battlefield. But if he knew that Medisha was just a spirit, he would probably regret underestimating her. Hearing his words, the young man nodded and asked, "Promise." Mr. Coden promised to lead me to you and return to the surface. He is very familiar with the terrain here. He knows where the tunnels are, where it connects to the next level, and where it can be opened without causing a large-scale collapse. Medisha explained in detail. Although she was speaking in Cruz, it was as if she could naturally sing an elvish aria. "My lord, there is an elevator not far from here. It leads to the main tunnel on the 3rd level. There are many tunnels leading to the surface, so it shouldn't be blocked. She smiled. If it wasn't for Mr. Coden, I wouldn't have been able to find this place so quickly. Brando knew that she was talking about the elevator that Cohen and the others came down from. He remembered that the tunnel was very large with 3 wooden tracks. He nodded and looked at Coden. What is his condition? Let Mr. Coden tell us. Coden glanced at Brando. Boy, I know what you're planning to do. Originally, as a prisoner, I had nothing much to say. Now, you can naturally take over this place as you wish. It will take at least a month and at most 3 months. Lord Paulus won't notice any clues. He paused for a moment. My condition is simple. I don't want to end up like Grodin. He knows. Brendel's heart skipped a beat. The riot in Abies could not be kept a secret, but not everyone knew about Grodin's death. It was common knowledge that a riot in Erwin's territory was not a big deal, but other than a few unlucky ones, no one had ever heard of a lord with real power being killed in a riot. Therefore, after the riot in Abies, most people guessed that Grodin had escaped through a secret tunnel. Only a few of the higher-ups in Brendel's organization knew that Grodin could not be more dead. Brendel looked at Coden deeply. If the outside world knew about Grodin's death, then the situation would be completely different. Lord Paulus might not be able to wait and send out his troops, and Count Randner might not give Tonagel enough time to deal with the problem himself. If the old fox sensed that his territory was in danger of being separated, he would send out his army in less than 2 weeks. Brando hoped that the news would not be balanced to buy time. If Count Randner did not know whether Grodin was dead or not, then he would be inclined to let his useless son deal with the problems in his territory. At that time they were just a bunch of rioters in the eyes of the nobles. Rioters were nothing to be afraid of, and Grodin had many retainers under him. But with Grodin's death, this small rebellion was treated as a rebellion. Even though he knew that he was starting a rebellion, even if it wasn't to divide Awen, his actions were seen as a serious challenge to the rules of the game in the eyes of the nobles. According to Brendel's plan, Count Randner would only realize this after Lord Maxon and Lord Paulus were defeated. Brendel still had 1 or 2 months before that. Coden seemed to have seen through his thoughts. The old man smiled mysteriously. You don't have to worry, it's just a rumor. But when I see you all here, I'm 80% sure that the people in Ferber aren't rioters. Coden shook his head. But I don't know if it's you or me who's crazy. Ever since the year of the Zither, Erwin hasn't had a rebellion for almost 100 years. Brando nodded. The year of the Zither was the era of Hesse I, who was nicknamed the King of the Roads. He was the most notorious king in Erwin's history, and one of the last rulers of the Cipher dynasty. This nickname came from the fact that he organized an army to rob all the merchants who passed through Erwin, regardless of whether they were local or foreign. He openly declared that all property in Erwin's territory belonged to him, and all merchants who traveled on the roads had to pay him 2/3 of the value of their goods. This act of his angered everyone except for him. In the end, Hesse I was ousted from the throne after only 3 years. He was the only king in Erwin's history to die in the hands of the angry people. Of course, from His Majesty's performance, it could be seen that the people of Awen were in dire straits at that time. That was the darkest era in Erwin's history. If not for the rise of Madara, the current Erwin would not have been as chaotic as it was then. That was also the era in Erwin's history when uprisings, riots, and rebellions were the most frequent. In Won's world, it was rare to see the word uprising in the history books. But perhaps this was the so-called power and fortune of the nation. Madara had to borrow Awen's strength to rise, so the Corvado dynasty was able to rise under the same circumstances. But under better conditions, Princess Griffin's reforms failed. But Brando did not have time to sigh. He shook his head and said, "This condition is too vague. We can coexist peacefully here, but once we leave the underground and reach the surface, how can we guarantee that you won't run away and spread the news?" It was not unreasonable for him to think this way. If it was the subterranean dwellers, he could ask Tajiv to swear to their gods. But humans were probably the least religious people in the world. Although they often talked about Lady Martha, even if they swore to Martha, most of them would not take it seriously. Brendel was a human himself, so he knew this better than anyone else. But Coden shrugged and said, "This old man is seriously injured. I can't run away even if I want to." If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 299. Brando smiled. You might not be able to escape now, but that might not be the case in the future. Once you recover your strength, no one will be able to stop you. There were some things that he did not say. Brando could not possibly leave 2 gold-ranked warriors in the mines just to watch over one person. Coden placed a hand on his sword, but he quickly let go. The old man could sense that the young man was interested in his suggestion, or else he would not have said so much to him. If that's the case, what do you think we should do? Brando pondered for a moment and asked. What's the name of the clerk in the mines? Coden was stunned. He could not keep up with Brendel's thoughts. He didn't understand why the topic was brought up to the noble clerk, but he still replied, Perkins. Perkins from the Sykerville family? You know him. Coden narrowed his eyes. He instinctively sniffed out Brendel's identity. It was likely that he was a young noble. After all, a normal person would not have such a clear understanding of the nobles. It was just like how a well-informed person in the capital might know the names of the nobles above him, but outside of Corvado, he might not know the nobles in the other provinces. However, Perkins was the nephew of Count Ranner's wife, and belonged to the same class as Grodin in the Ranner province. It was impossible for Brando not to have heard of him. Even though Perkins was not famous in this era, the players would have to deal with the young nobles as the old nobles gradually aged and passed away. Brando remembered that Perkins was the lord of the Silman region, but he did not expect him to be the clerk of the Schaflund mines. He immediately realized that the silver mines were Count Ranner's confidant, and it was possible that Perkins had gained the Count's trust from there. He cursed in his heart. This kid's bright future is going to be ruined because of my actions. But in the spirit of not letting his friends die, he had no choice but to say sorry in his heart. I heard that he's a decent guy. Brendel asked in a roundabout manner. That's a nice comment. Coden raised his eyebrows. It would be better to say that he's as timid as a mouse and mediocre. He didn't hold back at all as he mocked. Perkins had destroyed a squad of his subordinates, and this old man was still brooding over it. You nobles just love to say nice things. After saying that, he looked at Brando provocatively. Brando didn't care about Coden's probing. He was just pondering in his heart. According to Coden's evaluation of Perkins and his understanding of Perkins, that young clerk would do everything he could to suppress the chaos in the mines for the sake of his own future. He definitely wouldn't send someone to inform Lord Paulus. This way they would have plenty of time to search for the path to the surface. Whether or not the elderly swordmaster would lead the way wouldn't affect his plan at all. But when he looked at Coden, he had another idea. He didn't want a gold-ranked expert to return to Count Ranner's hands, but it was a problem to keep him here. Coden didn't seem to be completely loyal to Count Ranner, or else he wouldn't be here to negotiate with them. However, he still had the demeanor of a knight. It wouldn't be easy for him to surrender, especially when he didn't have the strength to do so. Brando thought for a moment and had a plan in mind. Then I'll have to trouble you to come back to Abies with us for the time being. After this period of time, I will naturally let you go. It will take at least a month and at most half a year. He didn't mind sending 1 or 2 gold-ranked experts to watch over the swordmaster in Abies. Half a year. Coden narrowed his eyes. If I don't appear in the mines for a long time, it will arouse suspicion. Aren't you worried that the news will be leaked? Brando thought that this old man was really cunning, but he had already considered this point. It's fine. Didn't you suffer heavy injuries in the earthquake? You'll need some time to recuperate, and I think Hawkins will understand. He purposely emphasized the words Hawkins will understand. Coden snorted in disdain. He knew why the clerk would understand. If he didn't, the young man would use his sword to make him understand. The clerk wasn't a tough nut to crack. He could imagine that if Brando threatened him, the clerk would cry and become their mouthpiece. The old man fell silent. It seems like you've made up your mind. But how can I guarantee that I can leave after a month or half a year? He asked again. Why should I guarantee that? Brando retorted. Coden was stunned. He raised his silver-gray eyebrows and glared at Brendel. But since I asked you to go to Abies, as long as you don't act rashly, I won't do anything unnecessary. Brando replied. I won't make unnecessary sacrifices. You're a veteran of the November War, aren't you? Life is precious and the winner of a war is the one who survives, the old man snorted. You know very well that there are survivors of that war among your elders. Brando did not answer and only stared at the old man. The old man glanced at the ring on Brando's finger and remained silent for a while. He then asked, Judging from your actions, you're planning to stay here for a long time. But I have to remind you that Count Ranner will not allow a territory to be separated from his control, even if it's the most barren Tonajal. Are you prepared to face the wrath of a king? Other than Corvado, Erwin was controlled by 13 vassals. These vassals included 6 dukes, 2 marquises and 5 counts with special privileges. Their power was comparable to the royal family, and they were nicknamed the kings under the throne by the people. Among these kings, other than Duke Arek, Duke Vero, and Duke Cipher who were the strongest, the rest of them were on par with each other. Count Ranner was not the strongest among them, but he was not the weakest either. In Coden's opinion, Brando and the others were like ants trying to challenge a giant. They could be crushed at any time. However, Brando laughed and shook his head. You've got 2 things wrong. First, I knew what Count Ranner would do from the start. Second, Tonajal is not the most barren of lands. Coden looked at him deeply. Confidence is a good thing, but arrogance is not necessarily the same, young man. I agree. Brando replied. Fine, I don't care what you think. The old man shook his head and stopped talking about it. He placed his hand on his sword once more. I still want a promise. Promise me that you will let me leave after at least half a year. You promise that you won't return to Count Ranner's side? I'm sorry, but I can't promise that. Coden replied firmly. Brando looked at him with admiration, but he did not refuse this time. He smiled. Fine, I promise. I don't need half a year, just 3 months. The old man was slightly taken aback. He raised his head and looked at Brendel in surprise. Brando smiled and did not explain. After reaching an agreement, Medisha was also done resting. She felt the soul fire in her body becoming active again, and they continued on their journey. At this time, Brando glanced at the miner behind them. In fact, when he found out that Brando and Scarlet were not part of the mine's garrison, but were traitors who wanted to go against Count Ranner, the poor man was terrified and almost wanted to run away. But he quickly calmed down. Compared to thinking about the future, the monsters that were lurking in the mines would immediately take his life. In the end, the man still followed them. But he met Scarlet, and after the red-haired girl threatened him fiercely, the miner had no choice but to bring his family to Abes with him. During the conversation, Brando found out that the man had also learned some skills as a silversmith, so he decided to give him a job as an apprentice blacksmith. In comparison, this job was much safer than being a miner, and the benefits were much greater. In the end, the man still felt uneasy, but he could not help but look forward to it. With these thoughts in mind, he felt the people in front of him stop again. But this time they did not encounter any monsters or people. Instead, there was no way out. To be exact, everyone saw a dark door not far from them in the mine tunnel. The door was tightly shut and sealed off the entire tunnel. Medisha and Scarlet could not help but stop and look at Coden. He said that this path could lead to the elevator. But when they saw the old swordsman's face, they could not believe what they saw. This is... Coden was slightly taken aback. Shouldn't I be asking you that? Scarlet frowned. Her voice was weak, but it was filled with suspicion. No, what's going on? Coden frowned and said to Medisha. Miss, can you help me over there to take a look? Medisha looked at Brando with a questioning gaze, and the young man nodded. He had been here before and knew that the old man was not lying. There should not be such a door in this place. He had a suspicion, but he still needed to confirm it. The Silver Elf Princess did as she was told, supporting the elderly Master Swordsman as they walked over. The Master Swordsman used his hand to feel the cold, heavy giant door as he muttered to himself. How is this possible? How is this possible? Chapter 300. My lord. Scarlet looked at Coden, who was muttering to himself, and asked in a low voice. Brando shook his head and signaled for her to calm down. The door must have appeared out of nowhere, and it might have something to do with the monsters. Sure enough, Coden suddenly stopped and whispered. There are words on the door. Everyone leaned over and sure enough, they saw some strange patterns engraved on the black iron door. To be more precise, they were words. Brando saw the trapezoidal characters and immediately said, "It's the language of the dwarves. It's the dwarven language." Dwarven language. Coden frowned and turned his head. Why is there dwarven language here? Tonajal only has the hill dwarves, and they don't live underground. What about the gray dwarves and the iron dwarves? Medisha asked. The gray dwarves and the iron dwarves were both creatures that lived underground. The gray dwarves were close relatives of the alpine dwarves, while the iron dwarves were said to be descendants of the rune dwarves. But Brando shook his head. The gray dwarves and the iron dwarves both use the cuneiform script of Jorgandi Ridge, and not the trapezoidal script of the dwarven language. In fact, the trapezoidal script was the official language of the dwarves. The cuneiform script was invented by the dark elves. Then who could it be? The silver elf princess asked. Brando thought about the silver inheritance and suspected that it might be a branch of the silver dwarves that had disappeared. There were 3 silver dwarves: the storm dwarves, the rune dwarves, and the fire dwarves. Apart from the fire dwarves who lived in the fire elemental world, this inheritance could be one of the first 2. But before he could speak, Scarlet pointed her lightning spear at the door, and a soft ding sounded from the darkness. The girl looked at the door and saw that it was as smooth as a mirror. There was not a single mark on it, which proved that the door was sturdy beyond imagination. She frowned and asked, "My lord, what is written on it?" "I don't know." Brando shook his head. "Boy, didn't you say it was the dwarven language?" Coden raised his eyebrows in annoyance. "How can you not know?" "I only know what the dwarven language looks like," Brando thought to himself. He was not in the amber space where the system could automatically translate. Here, he could only stare helplessly at these things. However, he walked over and placed his hand on the door. "However, I suspect that this is a barrier." "Barrier? Was it a spell? Is it an illusion?" The old man raised his silver-gray eyebrows. "There are other people underground?" He looked at Brando suspiciously. "You're not the only one here?" Brando shook his head. "This enchantment is not a spell. Wizard's magic is just using the laws of the world. However, in ancient times, enchantments were set up by the gods. These barriers themselves represent a kind of law." Coden did not understand, but Medisha's eyes widened. "Ancient heritage? My lord, are you saying that there's a sacred place behind this?" "It's not a holy land. I'm afraid it's a sanctum." Brando sized up the door. The entrance to a holy land could not be so small. It was like a valley in the land of the fairies, and it was large enough to accommodate 2 huge statues. However, if this was a sanctum used to store the silver legacy, then it made sense. The young man placed his hand on the cold iron door and closed his eyes, as if he could feel the thousands of years of history behind the door. At the same time, he asked, "Medisa, what is the ancient heritage of the silver elves?" The elven princess paused for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't know. I've never been to the sanctum." When the War of the Holy Saints began, the silver elves had already left the sanctum for 10 generations. It was said that we could no longer find our way back. Brando shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not the case. The silver elves should have returned to the sanctum by now." "What is the name of your sanctum?" "Sanctum Silver Valley." Brendel nodded, but Scarlet asked in confusion, "My lord, this isn't the time to talk about this, is it? Shouldn't we find a way to open this door first?" "I'm trying," Brando replied. "Huh. For an ancient barrier, the door is a symbol of an entrance," Brando replied. "The meaning of an entrance is to enter. If you just want to go to the other side of the tunnel, you won't be able to open this door no matter what." "Enter? Enter where?" The red-haired girl was puzzled. "You'll know soon enough." Brando closed his eyes and thought enter in his heart. Then suddenly everyone felt their vision go dark. But before the sound of panic could be heard, the light became bright again. To be exact, it became brighter. It was as if they had suddenly returned to the surface. Bright and dazzling light shone from the outside. Every pair of eyes that had adapted to the darkness could not help but squint slightly. The surroundings were snowy white, and their eyes hurt slightly. Scarlet and the miner subconsciously turned their heads. Only the stronger Coden and Medisha could stare at their surroundings. But the two of them immediately let out a low cry. The voices around them suddenly became louder. It was a tsunami of cheers that poured into everyone's ears like a tidal wave. And as everyone gradually adapted to the dazzling light and the deafening cheers around them, they looked up and finally saw everything around them. They remembered that they were still in the dark underground tunnel just a moment ago, blocked by a thick iron door. But now they found themselves in a brightly lit square. Or worse, after looking a little further, everyone found that it was not a square at all, but a gladiator arena. They stood in the middle of the empty space, but there were towering walls and spectator seats in all directions. The spectator seats were full. Brando could not see the faces of the spectators against the bright light, but he knew that it was just a projection of a spell. A gap space. That was the content of this barrier. In terms of complexity, this dimension was far less mysterious than Fairyland, which existed in the crevice between space and time. It was merely a demi-plane connected to the world of Vaunt's main material plane, a small subspace. But in terms of the sound and light effects, it was enough to make people dizzy. He could not help but think that it was that guy who designed all of this. "What is this place, my lord?" Scarlet finally calmed herself down, and could not help but ask in a trembling voice. She was still all right, but the miner was already paralyzed with fear. Medisha and the old man did not say a word, but the former was obviously calmer, while the latter was vigilant with his hand on his sword. "The Arena of Destiny," Brando replied. "The Arena of Destiny? What is that?" Brando looked up. "Do you see that sword?" Following this question, everyone followed his gaze, and saw that in the middle of the arena, there was a stone tablet with a long sword stabbed into it. The black longsword reflected a layer of faint light under the dazzling light, but the shape of the sword was quite strange. It looked like a longsword, but it was as wide as a palm, and the blade was much longer than an ordinary longsword. It was better to say that it was a combination of a two-handed greatsword and a longsword. "What is that?" Coden looked at the sword, his eyebrows twitching. As an experienced swordsman, of course he could see that it was an excellent sword. "The Haurangaya," Medisha replied. "I recognize this sword. It is the silver legacy of the Rune Dwarfs." "Yes, this is the Haurangaya. Legend has it that it is connected to the earth, and when it is swung it will cause the earth to shake and mountains to collapse." Brendel knew the sword's other name. The players called it the Sword of Earthquake, because Haurangaya's attack was accompanied by an earthquake spell that was equal to the damage of the sword itself. Earthquake was an area of effect spell, and its range was almost the same as the direction and range of the sword wind. Although it consumed mana, it was definitely worth it. This sword was a divine weapon for spell swordsmen. Even Brando could not help but move his fingers when he saw it. For a swordsman, this sword was too attractive. Not to mention, this sword also had a leadership attribute. The lead attribute usually appeared on equipment with obvious faction and attribute characteristics. For example, Haurangaya's relationship with the earth element could be seen from its name, so it could lead elemental creatures. Brando finally understood where the stone leopards came from. Haurangaya, the old man muttered to himself. Could this be the weapon of the giant Miguel? Brando nodded. Miguel was the most beloved son of Mother Earth, and the uncrowned king of the earth. In the legends, this sword was his scepter, and he used it to rule the earth. Of course, this was only a legend, but it made Brando's heart skip a beat. He took a deep breath and replied, "Those who come here will have the chance to obtain the sword through the challenge." He turned around and looked at everyone solemnly. "But there is a price to pay. If you fail, you will be turned into a stone statue and remain here forever." This is the meaning of the Arena of Destiny. In fact, Brando felt a headache coming on. The Arena of Destiny was one of the more difficult ancient quests. While he was having a headache, Coden asked, "How difficult is the challenge?" The old man looked at the sword and was a little tempted. Even though the old swordsman did not know where he was, but as the saying goes, the skilled are the bold. As a person who possessed the power of gold, he naturally would not be as scared as the miner who was still unable to utter a single word. "Very difficult," Medisha replied. "Because this place exists between fantasy and reality, there is no limit to the difficulty of the challenge." Everyone's expression changed when they heard the words "no limit." My lord, what about us? Scarlet asked. The elven princess shook her head again. There is no escape. Everyone has to challenge at least once before they have the right to leave this place. Everyone. The old man caught on to the word everyone. Yes, unless you are iron-ranked or below. You can only challenge alone and not together. Scarlet's face paled when she heard the answer. Then? If someone fails, what will happen? She was powerless now, and it was almost impossible for her to pass the challenge. You will be left here until the barrier disappears this time. You will be turned into a stone statue forever, Brando interrupted. But as long as someone is willing to take on another challenge and succeed, they will be able to save their companions. Don't worry, Scarlet. My lord. The red-haired girl was slightly startled. She understood the meaning behind Brando's words, and could not help but look at Brando with a complicated expression. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 301. But just as everyone was whispering to each other, a loud voice boomed from the arena, interrupting Scarlet's words. Mortals, welcome to the Hall of Heroes. The voice was cold and dignified, as if it was filled with an unstoppable power. You will challenge your own destiny here, whether it is for survival or to become the ruler of the land. Then lowly challengers step forth. Let us witness the birth of destiny. His voice reverberated in the arena like rolling thunder, causing everyone's faces to turn pale. Scarlet and Medisha turned to look at Brando, but Brando was observing the arena. He was trying to figure out what kind of challenges he might encounter. Destiny's arena had all sorts of monsters, but most of them were related to the environment of the arena. For example, in an ordinary arena like this, it was most likely that he would encounter powerful monsters on land or in the air. He sighed in relief. Thankfully, it wasn't the arena of the gods. The arena of destiny was one of the scariest arenas in the arena of destiny. Although the challengers weren't real gods, the creatures from myths and legends were enough to make one's scalp tingle. One by one, don't rush. I'll arrange the order. Brando looked at Scarlet. Scarlet, you and the miner will go together. None of you are iron-ranked or above, so you can be counted as a group. It'll be easier for me to save you. Medisha was taken aback by Brando's words. She couldn't help but look at the red-haired girl in confusion. Who is she? I'll explain later, Brando replied. Old mister, you're next. What? Coden raised an eyebrow. Are you worried that I won't be able to pass? Brando shrugged and looked at Medisha. Medisha, come with me. Can I? You're a summoned creature, so you should be able to give it a try. Brando thought that if a summoned creature could enter the arena with him, then he would be able to pass the challenge. But before he could celebrate, the scenery in the arena changed. The fences on the walls rose, revealing rows of cages behind them. My lord. Suddenly, a person stood up from the cage. When she saw the others outside, she shouted anxiously, Medisa Scarlet, I'm here. Brando's expression darkened when he looked over. The person in the cage was none other than the mercenary leader Yuta. Ko and Joka, and the rest of the people in the other cages also saw Brando. They all looked at him for help. Mister, can you help us? Joka shouted. Brendel did not say a word. He was not willing to help. He didn't mind, but if he wanted to help, he would have to go through at least 5 challenges. Based on this calculation, the highest level of challenge that he would face in the end would probably be the Mithril Sage. This was no laughing matter. From this point of view, the runic dwarves were clearly superior to the craftsmen of Buga. This was one of their prides. Brando knew very well that it would be difficult for him and Medisha to deal with a gold pinnacle existence. Although it was not impossible for them to win with the help of the wind spirit spiders, the chances were too slim. For this reason, he could only remain silent. Then the young man waved his hand and said, Chen, you go. Don't try to be brave, just admit defeat. Commander Yuda, Scarlet whispered. I'll save her, Brando replied. Go. The red-haired girl nodded. She gripped her lightning spear with one hand and dragged the miner who had fainted with the other into the arena. The stadium immediately erupted into thunderous cheers. Brendel listened carefully for a while before he realized that the audience was shouting Burning Claw. Burning Claw. Although he knew that this was just a product of fantasy and reality, he couldn't help but feel a little nervous. "Are you afraid, Medisha?" He turned his head and asked. "My lord," Medisha smiled. "I'm an undead." Brando immediately felt his face heating up. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he saw a giant door slowly open on the opposite side of the arena, and a terrifying monster leaped out from behind it with countless chains dragging behind it. It wanted to pounce on the red-haired girl in the middle of the arena, but it was held back by the chains. After a series of clanking sounds, it was forced to stop 20 meters away from Scarlet and let out a low growl. "What is that?" The old swordsman stared at the monster and asked. Brendel looked at the monster that was almost 2 stories tall. Its 3 heads collided with each other, and a thunderous roar came from its throat. Once it entered the arena, the entire arena was immediately filled with a foul stench, the smell of sulfur. "Cerberus," Medisha answered. "The demons under the sulfur river used to follow the dark dragon," the silver elf said in a low voice. "I've dealt with them on the battlefield before. They're very difficult to deal with." "What battlefield?" Coden looked at the elven girl with some doubt. He wondered what kind of battlefield would they fight with such terrifying creatures. But Medisha turned her head and smiled at the veteran who had participated in the November War. "The Battle of the Holy Saints." "The Battle of the Holy Saints?" Coden was stunned. He instinctively thought that the little girl was joking with him. No matter how he looked at it, Medisha was a cunning little girl. "Fortunately, it's not a Cerberus lord. It has the strength of a silver-ranked monster. As long as we're careful, we should be fine," Brando said to Coden. "Be careful of its breath." "Kid, are you reminding me?" The old swordsman was stunned for a moment before he reacted. "I just don't want to save one more person." "Humph, that's because you haven't seen my true strength, kid," the old swordsman said as he stroked the hilt of his sword. "You should worry more about yourself," Coden said with a sigh in his heart. In fact, the old swordsman had been unlucky since the beginning. When he was about to make his move, he was interrupted by the landslide. Then he was caught off guard by Medisha's sneak attack, and almost died in the mining accident. For an experienced gold-ranked swordsman like him, it was too embarrassing. Even though he was injured, dealing with a silver-ranked monster shouldn't be a problem for him. Moreover, in the same class, be it magical creatures, monsters, or low-level demons, none of them could compare to intelligent beings. That was because apart from absolute strength, they had far fewer skills. The old swordsman had already made up his mind to vent his anger on these small fries. He even turned to Brando and said, "Do you want me to help you save someone, kid?" "No need." Brando quickly shook his head. Thinking that the old swordsman didn't know what was good for him, the difficulty level of the Arena of Destiny would increase with each round. This time it was a 3-headed Cerberus. Next time it might even be a mountain giant. Coden snorted softly, as if he was dissatisfied with Brando's disdain. "What's your name, kid?" he suddenly asked. Brando was staring at the arena. When he heard the question, he didn't even hesitate to answer. "Sue." "Brando." He suddenly realized something and stared at the old swordsman. "What's the matter, old man? Do you want to remember my name so that you can settle accounts with me in the future?" To his surprise, the old swordsman didn't glare at him. Instead, he repeated the name twice. "Brando, Brando." Then he suddenly smiled mysteriously and didn't say anything else. Coden's reaction was completely out of Brando's expectations. He put his hand on his sword to prevent the old swordsman from acting rashly. After all, it wasn't a joke to cause trouble in the Arena of Destiny. Just as Brando was about to raise his guard, the situation in the arena changed. Scarlet immediately admitted defeat. Before the 3-headed Cerberus could break free from its chains, a white light flashed and she was sent to a cage not far away. "Scarlet." Yuta looked at her companion in shock. Scarlet red hair reminded her of her younger sister. She couldn't help but ask with concern, "Why didn't you resist?" "I'm sorry, I'm injured," the red-haired girl replied with a gloomy expression. Yuta frowned. "But you don't know the rules here. Every additional person will make it harder for the others to save them." She sighed and said in a low voice, "But it's fine. Whether that young noble will save us is still a question. Nobles won't put themselves in danger." Scarlet sat down in the corner of the cage in despair. Compared to herself, she was more worried about her mercenary group. If anything happened to her here, Cornelius and Rabin wouldn't be so polite. But while she was worried, Scarlet didn't say anything. She grabbed the bars and looked towards Brando's direction. She didn't know why, but she knew that Brando would save them. Not only her but Yuta as well. At this time, Brando was looking at the old swordsman walking towards the arena with a solemn expression. Coden held his sword in one hand and stared at the three-headed Cerberus without fear. But when he was about to leave, he suddenly turned around and said to Brando, "Humph, arrogant taboo's brat. I'll show you what true swordsmanship looks like. I'll show you how arrogant you are." When Brendel heard this, he was stunned for a moment. Taboo's was his grandfather's name. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 302. Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized that Crone was a veteran of the November War. It was not surprising that he knew his grandfather. But Crone was born into a knight's family. The difference between him and his grandfather was like the difference between a nobleman and a commoner. How did they know each other? He decided to put this question aside for the time being. The battle had already begun, and the Cerberus seemed to be extremely displeased that its prey had disappeared from its sight. As soon as Crone stepped into the arena, the monster howled and struggled to break free from its chains. The chains that were as thick as a man's arm broke off one by one. Damn it, Crone thought to himself. He pulled out his sword and threw the scabbard away. The monster that came from the Sulphur River was already charging towards him, dragging the broken chains behind it. Crone raised his eyebrows and raised his eyelids slightly. His dark gray pupils reflected the demon that was charging towards him. He took a step back with his right foot, raised his sword with both hands and roared, "You're too weak." Scram! A clear shockwave suddenly erupted from Coden's body in all directions, and the Cerberus in the air was swept away. The speed of the shockwave was comparable to that of a wind bullet. The shockwave was like a sharp knife as it shot forward for about 100 meters before it gradually weakened and disappeared. But before that, the Cerberus had already crashed into the wall on the other side of the arena. With a loud bang, countless bricks collapsed. Smoke and dust filled the air. Holy shit! Brando couldn't help but exclaim in his heart. This was a swordsman's blade burst. It was a type of swordsmanship. But to push the shockwave 100 meters away, how much did the core swordsmanship have to be? In the Amber Sword, all skills were divided into basic skills and skills. For example, White Raven swordsmanship and frontal assault relied on Brando's military swordsmanship. Power burst and charge relied on the three attributes of strength, constitution, and dexterity. The higher the level of the core swordsmanship, the stronger the constitution, and the greater the power of the skill. But at this stage, the blade burst had to be pushed 100 meters away. Brando had never heard of such a thing before. He remembered that he was around this level in the game when he was around level 80 to 90. Crone, on the other hand, was only level 45 at most. At this time, the Cerberus stood up from the rubble. It shook its three large heads, and sand and stones fell from its body and head. It looked like it was in a sorry state. But in reality, the Sulphur River demon wasn't seriously injured, especially when it hit the wall. If it was standing on the ground, it would have suffered a lot. But in the air, the resistance of the Cerberus was much lower. By the time it stood up, Coden was already right in front of it. The old man didn't use charge. Instead, he leaped across the sand like a bolt of lightning, covering a distance of 30 meters with each leap. Cerberus bared its fangs as it raised its head. Its big, wheel-like eyes had already caught sight of the approaching sword. There was no room for it to dodge. It didn't even have time to feel fear. With a loud bang, everyone saw the old man holding his sword with both hands, leaping high into the air and chopping down on the head of the demon that came from the Sulphur River. The tip of the sword went straight into the hilt and continued downward, splitting the huge head into two. Crone landed on the ground and swung his sword to the side. Black blood splattered on the sand. However, he immediately retreated, avoiding the fate of being sprayed by the stinky black blood. The Cerberus couldn't withstand the force and fell to the ground. However, the ferocious beast didn't give up. When Crone retreated, its two remaining heads each spat out a pillar of fire. The Cerberus was prepared for this, but he didn't expect the pillar of fire to have such a long range. Like a flamethrower, the pillar of fire covered half of the field. He quickly rolled to the side, but his clothes, eyebrows and beard were all burned off. This accident made him tremble in anger. The beard that he had painstakingly grown out was his most precious treasure. Crone roared and charged at the Cerberus. He punched the chin of the Cerberus' left head. Everyone heard the crisp sound of bones breaking. But this wasn't the end of it. The immense force lifted the Cerberus, which was as tall as a one-story building, off the ground. The Cerberus' body weight was lifted by the Cerberus' left head. It was as if the Cerberus would fall back down and crush the Cerberus. However, Coden didn't move at all. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and swung his sword upwards from the hellhound's lower left hip, all the way to its upper right shoulder. With a loud tearing sound, the hellhound was split into two in midair. Black blood splattered and fell like raindrops. The two halves of the Cerberus body fell to the ground. There was a moment of silence. Yuta, who was locked in the cage, gasped. Fear flashed in her green eyes. Amazing! She wasn't the only one. The youths in the other two cages were stunned. Their mouths were wide open but no sound came out. The power of a gold-tier rancor was truly inhuman. When it was fully unleashed, it had an overwhelming impact. He's injured, Scarlet said, grabbing the bars with both hands. Otherwise, he wouldn't have to go through so much trouble. Yuta nodded. She knew that it was difficult for her to understand, but Scarlet, who had experienced it firsthand, knew better than her. Meanwhile, Joka, who was in the other cage, was whispering to the skinny youth beside him. Koan, do you think they'll save us? Joka asked. The skinny youth shook his head. It's hard to say. I don't think so. Mar looked outside with a complicated expression. Why would they save us? We're not related to them. Besides, this isn't a joke. What will happen to us? Joka asked. The skinny youth shook his head again. I don't know. We won't be locked up here forever, right? Some of the youths were already crying. Can't you think of a way, Koan? Joka was getting anxious. He didn't want to be locked up here forever. I'll try. Koan looked outside and answered. Who's going to help you? Joka asked. The captain of the guards, of course. I heard that no one in Tanajil is a match for him. Someone said. Everyone looked at Koan, but the skinny youth didn't answer. He looked at the arena. Brendel was not surprised by Coden's victory. He was more surprised by the old man's injuries. Why would a gold-rank swordsman need to go through so much trouble to deal with a Cerberus? He turned his head slightly. How badly did you hurt him? The strike of 1,000 armies. Medisha answered softly. The youth wiped the sweat off his forehead. What kind of monster was Coden? How could he survive a strike of 1,000 armies? But Medisha quickly added, I didn't hit him. He dodged it, but he was hit by the wind and hit a rock. I followed up with another attack and he surrendered. He didn't have a strong will to resist. Brando suddenly remembered that Coden had shouted for him to stop. He realized that Coden must have recognized him from the start. He rubbed his forehead. How did Coden recognize him? His swordsmanship wasn't the same as his grandfather's. After the November War, Erwin's swordsmanship was reformed, but it was simplified by the players. But he didn't have time to think too much about it. The battle in the arena began again, and the old man challenged him again. The three-headed Cerberus corpse disappeared in a flash of white light. A fence rose from the southwest, and a fully armored dwarf walked out from behind it. When the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard, the silver elf princess suddenly said, My lord, I know this person. Brendel looked at the dwarf who was covered in heavy plate armor, and had a four-horned helmet on his head. He carried a warhammer that was almost half his size on his shoulder. The symbol of a burning fist was painted on the warhammer and said, That's right. That's right. That's right. I know him too. Lord Avalion. He's a very famous lord among the Grey Dwarves. He was once a slave of the Rune Dwarves. But this is only an illusion, not the real person. He added. He's about as strong as a gold-ranked dwarf. Coden is in trouble now. Medisha didn't answer. Instead, she looked at her master curiously. She knew that Brando was a planeswalker, But a planeswalker wasn't a prophet. There was no doubt that Brando knew a lot of things that he shouldn't have. The history of the Rune Dwarves had long since turned to dust. Not to mention the humans, even among the Buga wizards. Only those old men with white beards and glasses who buried their heads in books all year round could understand some of the secrets between the Silver Elves and the Rune Dwarves. But just as Brando said, Coden was in trouble. Evalian wasn't as agile as him, but the old man couldn't pose any threat to the dwarf. Evalian's war hammer was called Raging Flame, and when it was swung, everything within a radius of 20 meters would be covered in a firestorm. Coden tried to attack a few times, but in the end his beard and eyebrows were burned into a mess. The battle was in full swing and everyone, especially the youths in the cage, had their hearts in their throats. In their eyes this old man was their hope, but now this hope was in a bitter battle, and this made their confidence waver for a moment. This was only the second battle. In the end, Coden was forced into a corner by Evalian. Both sides had similar battle experience. Evalian's illusion represented his heyday in the gladiator arena, while Coden was a veteran who had survived the November War. However, the Grey Dwarf Lord was obviously more energetic, and his excellent magic armor gave him a huge advantage. The dwarf let out a roar and finally used his most powerful attack. His war hammer was ignited in flames, and he swung it towards Coden like a meteor. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 303. Ah! The girl beside Cohen let out a low cry. On the other side, Scarlet's eyes flashed with confusion. The old swordsman did not retreat. Instead, he raised his sword and clashed with Varian's hammer for the first time. Ding! An ear-piercing sound pierced through the entire arena. Everyone could not help but close their eyes and cover their ears subconsciously. But the next moment, the youths in the cages were shocked to see Coden sweep Varian's hammer away. Everyone had only one thought in their minds. This is impossible. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He knew that Coden had been hiding his strength all this while, waiting for this final blow. But what really surprised him was that when the old man attacked, only he and Medisa saw a flash of blue light on the old man's right index finger. Wind bullet. Brando looked at the ring on his right index finger. Although the ring of the Wind Empress could be found all over Wound, this was too much of a coincidence. He was distracted for a moment and missed the moment when Coden took off Varian's helmet and stabbed him in the throat. When he came back to his senses, the Dwarf Lord's corpse had turned into white light and disappeared. However, the old man did not have it easy either. His hasty attack had caused him to suffer a punch to his chest. Varian's gauntlets were full of metal spikes. Not only did the punch penetrate and injure his lungs, it also caused his chest to become a bloody mess. But the worst part was the exhaustion of his physical strength. After the victory, the old swordsman could not hold on anymore. He supported himself with his sword and panted for a while before he recovered. Then, Coden pointed outside the arena, and one of the cages with the youths in it opened. "Come out, Joka. Why are you here?" The old swordsman asked, panting. "Captain Coden?" The youths were stunned. They did not know what to do. They did not understand why Coden would save them first. What they did not know was that this guard captain was not with Brando in the first place. The old swordsman coughed. His injuries were very serious. If it had been anyone else, they would have died. However, he wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand. It was full of blood, but he didn't care. "All right, go to the side and stay there." He waved his hand at the youths. "What does this have to do with you? I'll ask you later." Joka and Mar were speechless. Although Coden had saved them, they had been captured in 2 batches. Cohen and his companions were still trapped in the cage, but it seemed that Coden had only saved them to find out what had happened. Furthermore, it seemed that the old guard captain did not intend to challenge them again. In fact, everyone knew that the old man did not have the ability to continue fighting. Even though Mar and Cohen often mocked each other, these youths had deep feelings for each other. It was hard for them to accept giving up on their companions. So what if it was hard to accept? They were powerless and could only stand there at a loss. "You guys go first, Joka." The skinny youth didn't seem to be panicking as he spoke to his companions. Cohen, take as much as you can. As for the rest, I'll think of a way myself. What is it? Joka asked. I don't know. Cohen answered honestly. Coden did not care about what the youths were saying. He only knew Joka and Mar because he was familiar with them. However, in his eyes, they were nothing more than a bunch of hoodlums from Shaflun town. They weren't worthy of his attention. Mortal, do you want to continue the challenge? A loud and majestic voice boomed across the arena. No. The old man refused the next challenge and limped to the side of the arena. At the same time he shouted at Brendel. How is it, Tobu's boy? Brando looked at him and shrugged. The old man walked over and threw his sword to Brando. Take this. I'll lend you this. It's your turn now. Let me see if that stubborn old man's descendant has improved. He then looked at Brando from head to toe. You're his son. He shook his head. You don't look like it. Grandson. But you look like you're in your early 20s and you're already a gold ranker. You're not any weaker than that bastard. Humph, the son of a general doesn't have a dog. Coden shook his head as if he was lamenting the fact that he didn't have a descendant. Brendel's hand almost dropped the sword he had just caught. What did he mean by you're already a gold-rank swordsman, and from this point alone, you're not inferior to your grandfather? He never knew that his grandfather was a gold-rank swordsman. No, wait a minute. According to Coden's words, he was far from being a gold ranker. He knew that he was able to become a gold ranker in half a year because of his cheat code. But if his grandfather also became a gold ranker in his 20s, he would at least be a seer. Brando slapped his forehead. He couldn't accept this information. In his memories of this world, his grandfather's family moved to Brags from other places. As for where they came from, he didn't know, and Brando never asked. He only knew that his grandfather used the money he brought to buy a piece of land in Brags, and then built a mill in the outskirts of Brags. Although he didn't come from a rich family, he didn't live a poor life. Otherwise, a young man like Brando would have either worked in the fields or become an apprentice. It was impossible for him to live alone in Bucci. Now that he thought about it, his grandmother didn't seem like a normal girl. Not only was she literate, but she also knew many things. His mother was from Kaliga, and came from a noble family. Her status was even more prominent. To be honest, Brando had never wondered why a noble's daughter would marry his father. No matter how rich a miller was, the gap between his bloodline and his status was difficult to cross. When Brando thought about it, he suddenly realized that the soul in his body didn't seem to understand his family and background. He suppressed his doubts and raised his eyebrows. You know him. I've known him for a while. That stubborn old man, the old man replied. At that time I was just a young man about your age. I just came out from the countryside of Togo. I said I was a knight, but I was just a wild boy. Your grandfather, on the other hand, graduated from a nobleman's academy. I was his subordinate for a period of time. He wanted to continue speaking, but at this moment, a loud voice above the arena interrupted their conversation. Next challenger. Coden raised his head and looked at the sky above the arena. Brando also stopped thinking about it. A person could meet all kinds of people in their life, but only a few people would leave an impression on you after a few decades. Usually, you would remember them through a small connection. He guessed that their relationship wasn't as simple as what Coden said. He looked at his right index finger and saw 2 identical rings. This made him even more suspicious. When he was in Bucci, he had his suspicions. No matter how ordinary the ring of the Wind Empress was, it wouldn't fall into the hands of an ordinary miller. When Braggs asked the cripple about it, the latter's strange attitude made him suspicious as well. His suspicions were put aside for a while, but today, with the old man's reminder, it resurfaced. He looked at Coden and thought that as long as the old man was still in his hands, he would have plenty of opportunities to find out more. It seemed that he, or rather Brando's grandfather, wasn't a simple person. Then Brando and Medisha looked at each other and said in his mind, "Let's go." The Silver Elf Princess replied in her mind, "Yes, my lord." The two of them walked to the arena side by side. As they walked, the entire arena fell silent. 2 people. The youths were fine, but Jana and Coden were stunned. They knew Brendel and Medissa's strength, and they were at least gold-ranked. No matter how they looked at it, this was against the rules. You two. The old man hurriedly called out to them. Brando didn't answer. Medisha didn't say anything either. She followed the young man to the center of the arena. The two of them stood there and waited quietly. However, Coden quickly guessed the origin of the Silver Elf Princess. He suddenly remembered that Medusa's elemental power was soul. When they fought. However, there was only one kind of existence in this world that used souls as elemental power, and that was Madara's undead. Undead. The old man was suddenly enlightened. No wonder Medusa was so reckless during the landslide, because the undead had no fear at all. However, why would this young man have an undead following him? Coden's first thought was that he was a necromancer, but that was obviously wrong. First of all, a gold-ranked necromancer couldn't summon an undead of the same level. Secondly, Brando's eyes didn't have the purple or green light that represented soulfire. Coden suddenly gasped. A heroic spirit. He immediately guessed that Brando was a trainee knight of the Flame. The Flame Knight was the strongest fighting force in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It was a level 11 organization. Every Flame Knight was accompanied by the soul of an ancient hero from the War of the Holy Saints. These heroes were all knights who had once followed the Flame King Gretel. According to the Pale poem, the Flame King Gretel had 232 knights. Because of this, the Flame King Gretel never had more than 200 knights. However, he immediately shook his head. There were no silver elves among the knights that followed the Flame King. While the old man was puzzled, the youths at the side of the arena were whispering to each other. It's over, Joka sighed when he saw Brando and Medisha enter the arena. Can you stop being so discouraging? What do you mean it's over? The fight hasn't even started yet. Mar frowned when he heard his companion's words. He wasn't sure if Brendel would save Cohen or not. Did you forget? Joka turned around and said, if you're stronger than that Iron Knight, you can't fight together. What does that mean? Mar was stunned. This meant that Brando wasn't strong at all. They couldn't help but look at Cohen in the cage. The skinny youth's face was expressionless, but the girl beside him was gloomy. Damn it, I didn't expect this guy to be an embroidered pillow, Mar said angrily. He looks good, but he's useless. I thought he was strong. Didn't you always say he wasn't strong, Mar? One of the youths whispered. However, this sentence naturally received a fierce glare from the tall youth. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 304. No matter how sharp Brando's ears were, it was impossible for him to eavesdrop on the conversation of a few normal youths. Moreover, he was trying to familiarize himself with the sword in his hand. It was a magic sword, but it was a very common one and was slightly lighter than the average sword. This sword is at most a low magic item. I've used similar swords before, but I don't remember their names because I've used them over the years. The young man casually swung the sword, and the wind swept out left two shallow marks on the sand. Coden's eyes lit up when he saw this. It really is the White Raven Swordsmanship. Coden had recovered from his shock, but he immediately raised his eyebrows. The White Raven Swordsmanship is one of the most secretive swordsmanship in Erwin's palace. How did this kid learn it? He thought to himself. However, the youths also saw the same thing and began to argue. What is he doing? Mar asked with a frown when he saw the white light on Brendel's sword, and the sand around him was also covered in smoke. He's creating smoke, right? Joka replied with uncertainty. He's looking for an opportunity to defeat his enemy in the smoke. Don't you know that, Mar? He can't see anyone in the smoke, can't he? Joka was stunned for a moment before he rolled his eyes. Then there must be some sort of special technique. Why else would someone create trouble for themselves? It's easy to figure it out. However, Cohen interrupted them. He looked for a long time and finally confirmed it. He is familiarizing himself with the sword. Familiarizing himself with the sword? That sword was given to him by Captain Coden, someone said. But was it really okay to change swords before the battle? Even though the youths had not seen much of the world, they knew that it would affect the outcome. They could not help but look at the battlefield. Brando had stopped what he was doing and seemed to be ready. Medisha stood behind the youth with a silver shuttle in her hand. Because they were deep underground, her unicorn did not follow her. However, even on the ground, the Silver Elf's ancient battle techniques were not inferior. Coden had experienced it before, so he didn't dare to underestimate this little girl. The gate to the north of the arena opened once again. Behind it was the same three-headed hellhound that had died once before. This giant beast's claws were on the ground, and its 3 heads were letting out low growls. Its 3 pairs of blood-red eyes were looking around, as if it was looking for its previous enemy. Its appearance caused a wave of low sighs, as if no one had expected this thing to come back from the dead. And this time, with the previous experience, the monster from the Sulphur River seemed to have learned its lesson. It waited for the owner of the arena to release it from its chains before it shook its black and red fur and entered the arena. It sniffed and revealed a cautious expression. It circled around and slowly approached Brando and Medisha. Everyone else thought that the dog had learned its lesson, but Coden smelled something unusual in the air. The old man stared at the center of the arena, his nose twitching. He couldn't help but frown and complain. This little guy doesn't know how to control his aura. The whole arena is shrouded in his aura. Compared to him, the little girl is much gentler. His frown deepened. But what is this smell? An element? What kind of element is this? It's strange. The surroundings were getting colder and colder. Frost had even appeared on the sand on the walls. The flow of the air seemed to have stopped, as if the entire place was filled with a sense of stillness. Even the youths who were dozens of meters away felt as though they had lost their footing and were stuck in a quagmire, let alone Cerberus, who was right in front of him. The youth stared at the dog's 6 large blood-red eyes with a calm expression. However, the latter did not feel so good. The hellhound felt as if there was a heavy mountain pressing down on its body, and its front and back paws were shackled firmly. Not to mention attacking, it could not even take a single step forward. The hellhound subconsciously lowered its 3 heads, as if it wanted to resist this unstoppable force. Coden was slightly surprised. At this moment, the words stability and stillness were clear in Brando's mind. He felt as if he could touch the rules. Just like when he fought against Cabius, he felt as if the power of his element was in his hands, and he could use it at any time. He knew that this feeling was just an illusion. Compared to the gold stage, the power of his element was like a trigger that could not be controlled. But now this trigger had been triggered. Everyone, including the youths, felt that something was wrong. They saw the 2-story beast kneel down in front of Brando. The demon's limbs and chin were on the ground, as if it was a subject submitting to its king. It had no choice but to submit because the immense power made it unable to move. The young man stood there motionlessly, looking at the other party, as if he had accepted this kind of submission with a clear conscience. Everyone was stunned by this scene. Coden was even more stunned. What kind of element was this? Was it the aura of a king? Medisha, go. But Brando only said one sentence. Unlike everyone else, he felt a powerful force roaring in his heart, roaring to dominate everything. It was as if a terrifying beast would break out of its shell at any time. He even had the illusion that if he raised his hand, the world would collapse. It was as if he had the power of a god. Then the silver elf princess moved. The silver shuttle in her hand turned into a silver line that extended forward, the tip flashing with the cold light of death. Time seemed to be stretched by this attack. Everyone saw the simple silver line draw a semicircle around the arena, and then slowly approach the hellhound from one side. As long as it was moving forward, it could pierce through the demon's 3 heads. But at the last moment, under the pressure of the aura of death, the hellhound finally broke free from Brando's element. It used all its strength to raise its head and jump back. It had clearly avoided the fatal blow. But a strange thought flashed through Brando's mind. It was as if the entire world was under his control. With just a thought, he pulled the beast back. With a soft sound, Medisha's small body raised the spear. The silver shuttle pierced through the 3 heads and pulled the unlucky hellhound up high, throwing it forward. Its corpse fell to the sand with a loud thud. It was a one-hit kill. The youths, including Mar, were all stunned. Coden thought he heard his own jaw drop to the ground. The old man couldn't help but touch his chin to make sure that the item was still in his body. He couldn't be more shocked by the element of space. That's Joka felt as if something was stuck in his throat. The rest of his sentence was stuck in his throat. But no one laughed at him. Everyone was the same. Brendel noticed this as well. He looked at his own hand and was a little uncertain. Whether it was spatial lock or time stop, they were infinitely close to the element of existence. However, Melissa had already returned to his side. "My lord?" she asked in surprise. She was the one who had attacked, so she felt it more than anyone else. Brando waved his hand. He couldn't be sure. At this moment, a voice boomed above the arena. "Mortal, do you wish to continue?" "Of course," the young man replied with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Varian quickly entered the arena. "I'll do it this time," Brando said. He could feel that his control over his element was fading as he passed his peak. He had to test it out as soon as possible to confirm his suspicions. Metisha looked at him and guessed his intentions. She nodded slightly. Brendel put down his sword with his right hand and walked towards the Duergar. His cold aura once again pressed down on the Duergar. Varian was startled and snorted softly. The Grey Dwarf immediately threw away his arrogance and pretended to be relaxed in order to put pressure on his opponent. His two beady eyes sparkled under his helmet as he solemnly took down his warhammer from his shoulder and held it with both hands. He then shifted his center of gravity and entered a battle stance. This time even Joka could see it. It was a beast's instinctive reaction to danger. But was that young man really that scary? He stared at Brendel carefully. He could not imagine that the young man whom he had dealt with, who had a somewhat easygoing attitude, would be dangerous enough to make this dwarf who was like a steel fortress nervous just by looking at him. He might be strong, but he's still so young. Joka recalled his own experience. Brando's reaction was similar to the guards in the mines. He thought that their strength should be about the same, although that was already very strong in the Duergar's eyes. But he immediately knew that he was wrong. Brando had already attacked. In order to seize the opportunity, the young man charged forward. In the eyes of the others, it was unbelievably fast. They couldn't even see Brando's trajectory. They could only see his figure disappear and reappear in front of Varian in an instant. There were even ripples in the air behind him. The Duergar was startled, but his rich battle experience made him raise his warhammer with both hands to block. But his movements froze at this moment. Brendel's sword passed through his defenses like an illusion, passing through the gap between his helmet and breastplate, and piercing through his throat. The Duergar widened his eyes and only had time to let out a soft crack. Brando stopped in front of the Duergar like a ghost. He pressed one hand on the Duergar's warhammer and pulled back his sword with the other. The Duergar fell to the ground with a loud bang. Black blood slowly spread out from the Duergar's body. P.S. Thank you for your support. Did you like the latest chapters? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 305. Black blood slowly seeped out from the dwarf's body. If a needle were to fall from the sky at this moment, it would definitely make a ding sound when it hit the ground. Everyone would be able to hear it. Even the cheers in the arena stopped. Joka made a sound in his throat and turned to look at Mar. Mar also turned to look at him, and both of them saw the same look of disbelief in each other's eyes. Who is this young man? No matter how ignorant Joka was, he could tell that Brando was no ordinary person. But at this moment Brendel's heart was like a stormy sea. After the incident at Abi's castle, this was the second time he had entered an indescribable state. Time and space seemed to come to a standstill. The third definition of the elemental law appeared in his mind, but it felt like it was separated by a thin piece of paper. He could vaguely feel that it was also two laws. But the opportunity was fleeting, and when he reached out to grab it, the sound returned to the arena. The noise drowned out everything, and everything returned to normal. Brando was stunned for a moment before he sighed. It was still too early. If he was an intermediate gold, he would have entered the second stage of the elemental wall. But everyone was the same. Not everyone would enter the elemental wall immediately after reaching the peak of gold. The understanding of the laws was very important, and there were many geniuses who stayed in the gold realm for their entire lives. Not everyone was smart enough to understand the world. and sometimes it was easier to see the essence of the world without distractions. Brando also knew that this was a matter of appearance. He did not expect too much from things that depended on appearance. He could just rely on the ancient stone slab to break through the elemental wall. Unlike most people, the young man had a lot of ideas. But no matter what, this was not a bad thing. Just like now, Brando felt that he had a deeper understanding of stability and quietness. He could now confirm that these were related to the elemental wall. He looked at the sword in his hand. It was the sword that Coden lent him. There was a layer of transparent ripples on the blade. Elemental power. Indestructible. Accuracy increased by 20%. Speed increased by 100%. Additional 10% cold damage. He immediately identified the transparent ripples on his retina. This was the power of the elemental wall. Although it was not complete, at least it had gone from hidden to dominant, just like Scarlet's lightning elemental power and Medicia's soul energy. In fact, in terms of strength, Brendel was now on equal footing with Scarlet and Medica. But in terms of actual combat strength, he was far inferior. Brendel glanced at Coden and thought that he might be able to fight against a gold-ranked fighter. If he remembered correctly, the first obvious bonus of the lightning element was attack extension 20% increase in speed, and 30% additional lightning damage. This was the difference. Elemental power of the elemental wall. In the Amber Sword's elemental power, elemental power, elemental power, elemental power. In the later stages of the game, only the guild leaders of the major guilds or the famous R&B warriors in the entire server managed to level up through the cocoon transformation quest. However, Brando realized that his identity as an NPC allowed him to avoid this restriction. Space element. He really wanted to pour a bucket of water over himself to calm down. But at this time, a loud voice rang out again, interrupting his thoughts. "Mortal, do you wish to accept the next challenge?" Because of this voice, everyone focused their attention on Brando in the middle of the sand. Previously, they couldn't believe it. But now they suddenly realized that this young man had the ability to save them. In fact, it had far exceeded their expectations. Mar still could not believe that Brendel was stronger than the old guard captain, and he did not look like he was just a little bit stronger than him. Under their watchful eyes, Brando snapped his fingers to open the cage that held Yuta. Then he nodded. Thus, the challenge entered the next stage. "My lord." Medicia leaned over and looked at the young lord with her pale silver eyes. As someone who was born in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, the little princess didn't think that the Gold Realm was anything to be surprised about. Whether it was humans or silver elves, it was almost natural for them to reach the Gold Realm before the age of 20. However, as someone who had experienced this stage, she still asked with concern, "How is it?" Of course, she knew what happened to Brando before. Brando didn't say anything, but raised his sword and showed it to the silver fairy princess. "Ah!" This time Medicia was shocked. "Space element." "What?" Brando raised his eyebrows. He caught the surprise in the girl's tone and couldn't help but ask, "Shouldn't space element be very common in your era?" In his understanding, the War of the Holy Saints was the era where monsters ran rampant. There were also geniuses of the level of Tumen, so wasn't it common for a space element to appear? One must know that in the later stages of the Amber Sword, although space and time were rare, there were still more than a dozen players. How? Medicia's eyes widened in confusion. Back then, only the wizard leader of the Silver Alliance, the founder of the Tower of Stars and Moons, known as the last sage on Earth, Arkith, had space element. Earlier, only the Dark Dragon had it. The girl added. Huh. Brando sweated. To be honest, although he knew a lot about the background of the game, it wasn't as detailed as someone who had experienced it. Medicia's explanation was refreshing, but he couldn't help but think to himself. It turned out that the Amber Sword still compromised with the gameplay in the end. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed when he thought of the number of players who had the highest element in the hundreds. While the two were talking, the fence on the east side had risen. Everyone stared in that direction with their eyes wide open. The sound of neat hooves came from the shadows behind the fence, startling everyone. When the first enemy appeared in Brando's field of vision, he narrowed his eyes. It was a knight, or to be exact, a tin man riding on a puppet horse. They held a round shield in their left hand and a spear in their right, surrounded by 4 colored runes. Type 4 Night Hunter. Brando whispered to Medisha. What's that? An invention of the Hazel people. Be careful, these things have the strength of a peak silver. Brando and Yuta, the female mercenary leader on the side of the arena, said this sentence almost at the same time. Hazel was in the middle of Wonde, on the border west of Cruz. The two countries were separated by a towering mountain range. The Hazel people were not the descendants of the sages in the War of the Holy Saints. It was said that they came from another continent. The residents there believed in the power of magical technology, so they had the largest army in the whole of Wonde equipped with firearms and artillery. Even in their army, there were tanks and old-fashioned aircraft. The Hazel people and Cruz people were at war all year round, but neither side had gained any advantage in a head-on battle. They could face the Eagle Empire head-on without retreating. This was a testament to the strength of this country. However, when Yuta said this, she had an inexplicable feeling in her heart. She looked at the open cage and thought that Brando should save Scarlet first. But the young man did not. He did not even look at her, which could only mean that he did not care who he saved first. Because he wanted to save both of them, it was the same no matter who he saved first. However, her words did not elicit a response from Scarlet. Instead, they were heard by the teenagers. The enemies were at the peak of silver. They saw the metal knights coming out from behind the fence one after another. There were more than 30 of them. In the first round, the Hellhound was only at the peak of silver, but in the third round, the difference in strength increased by 30 times. So many. Someone whispered. Isn't this too unfair? Joka completely forgot that he thought it was against the rules for Brendel to bring Medisa and Medisa up together. How despicable. Mar could not help but grit his teeth. How dare they fight us with numbers? Brando caught the words and looked at the edge of the arena. Be careful of their spears, Brendel said to Medisa as he pointed at the metal knights. Be careful of their spears. There are firing mechanisms from the handle to the middle of the spear. There are actually 6 barrels. Gun barrels? The fairy princess was puzzled. Brando suddenly remembered that magicite technology was only a thing of the past 200 to 300 years. He quickly explained. You can think of it as a crossbow, but it has a strong penetrative power. Although it is not too much of a problem for us, it will still hurt if we get hit. Also, you have to protect your eyes and throat. Medisha nodded. Also, the 4 runes on their bodies will switch. This means that they are switching their attack methods. Red means heat ray, blue means ice shield, green means acceleration, and yellow means rock cover. Just pay attention to the red, it is a long-range attack. Brando continued. Understood. The Silver Fairy Princess could understand magic, but she was still curious about the Hazel's intricate design. Although the craftsmen of Buga were powerful, they were not as intricate as the Hazels. She then asked, Do you have a strategy, my lord? 2 gold-ranked warriors fighting against 10 silver pinnacle warriors was the limit. Of course, she and Brando were far more powerful than the average gold-ranked warrior, but it would still be difficult for them to fight against 30 silver pinnacle warriors. However, Brando shook his head. Just protect yourselves. Leave the rest to me. The Silver Fairy Princess was stunned. She then saw Brando raise his hand and snap his fingers. The crisp sound echoed throughout the arena, and everyone felt the light above their heads dim. They subconsciously looked up. Then he choked. Over 200 wind spirit spiders with shining holy swords blotted out the sky above the arena. That spectacular scene even caused the clamor in the surroundings to come to a halt. Outnumbered. Brando lowered his hand and looked at the youths in the distance. That's my line. P.S. If you think it's good, please vote for it. Thank you. Chapter 306. What is that? Everyone maintained the same action. They raised their heads, opened their mouths, and did not blink, afraid that they would miss a single detail. In the sky, countless holy swords were arranged at equal intervals, shining with golden light. They formed a huge diamond shape, as if the stars were inverted. The wind spirit spider was like a sky blue pattern on the holy sword, fusing together with the blade. Naturally, the Type 4 hunter riders also saw this scene. These metallic creatures raised their heads, and their prismatic crystal vision reflected a huge threat, so they made a uniform choice. The sound of spears being leveled drew everyone's attention back to the arena. The 30 Type 4 hunter riders pointed their spears at Brando. The 6 black barrels on the base of each spear were aimed at the young man. "Careful!" Someone shouted from the other side of the cage, but no one knew whose voice it was. Along with the shout, the magic conduction system began to rotate the 6 barrels, and with the crisp sound of gears grinding against each other, long tongues of flame appeared on the spears, 30 tongues of flame. Taiuna, ancient elven language, spirit wings. A spray of bullets brushed past Medisha, and dust flew everywhere. The Silver Fairy Princess reacted immediately, and the first thing she did was to raise her spear. Spiritual power was born from her back, and with her movement it spread out to both sides, forming a huge pair of wings made of light. The girls stood in front of Brando, and all the bullets were blocked by the hexagonal crystal lattice. For a moment, half of the arena was filled with flashing sparks, and the clanging sound was deafening. Everyone could not help but cover their ears when they saw this scene. The Type 4 hunter riders then turned their target to Medisha, who was the center of the spirit wings, but Brando had already raised his hand and pointed downwards. He stood on the other side of the arena, and pointed at the metallic knight, as if he was a commander giving orders. A buzzing sound came from the sky, and the holy sword began to glow, and then became white-hot. After the white-hot light lit up, it quickly gathered into a dazzling light at the tip of the sword, and in the next moment thousands of arrows were fired. It was an unforgettable scene for everyone present. Coden, Joka, Cohen, and Mar were all thinking about what was going to happen next. But even after exhausting their imaginations, they were still shocked by the spectacle of the next moment. Countless rays of light pierced into the ground in an instant. The air between the scorching light pillars seemed to have evaporated, giving people the illusion that the entire arena would be vaporized into ashes in the next moment. At that moment, Coden suddenly remembered a phrase that the crew's ancestors used to describe war in their Pale poem. "We saw the clouds parting and the sky turning crimson red. Steel seemed to be burning as it fell from the sky. Golden rain pillars fell diagonally onto the ground, and all living things fell into a sea of fire." It was so fitting. Coden had experienced the November War, and witnessed the destructive power of the wizards. They could even destroy an entire army with a wave of their hand. However, that was already in the past. Coden thought that he would never return to that nightmarish battlefield again. But now this familiar scene brought out the nightmare that had been buried in the deepest part of his heart, a nightmare that he would only occasionally see in his dreams. Coden did not realize that his pupils were dilating, his eyeballs were trembling, and his breathing had quickened. He instinctively reached for his sword, but he grabbed nothing but air. Coden broke out in a cold sweat, and then he remembered where he was. He was still in shock. He looked at the flames burning between the sky and the ground, and he was shocked by the power of the wizards. However, the metal creatures in the battlefield were more sensitive than him. The Type 4 hunters' reactions were simple. They stopped attacking at the same time and turned the yellow runes in front of them. As they did so, the rocks under the horses' feet rumbled and rose from the ground to form a rock barrier. The golden beam of light then fell from the sky and hit the rock wall. The rain of light splashed like molten steel on the outermost layer of the magically reinforced rock wall. The rock layer below was burned red, but it did not fall apart. The youths who were watching this scene from afar opened their mouths wide. A battle of this level had already exceeded the limits of their imagination. Whether it was the destructive rain of light that fell from the sky or the rock defense that could block such an attack, it was enough to deeply shock them. Joka did not move. Mar subconsciously retreated until he hit the bars on the other side of the cage. When he realized that, his forehead was covered in cold sweat. There was a layer of golden light in the deepest part of Cohen's eyelids. He clenched his fists tightly and stared at the scene without moving. Unlike most of the people who were attracted by the beautiful magical effects, he was looking at Brendel, who was in charge of all of this. "This is..." Yuta grabbed the bars with both her hands. The rain of light seemed to have penetrated into the deepest part of her soul, causing her to tremble. Only now did she realize how insignificant she and her mercenary group were, and how laughable their persistence was. There was no reason for this young man to appear here. She understood that even in this old kingdom, this kind of power was worthy of respect. As long as he was willing, he could obtain more power and authority than he currently had under any faction. Groudon's territory was nothing more than a joke to the mercenary leader. She could not understand why someone with such power would choose to live in such a barren land. He was even willing to fight against Count Randner in Erwin's upper plane. Yuta suddenly realized that she could not think of a single possibility that could explain all of this. But she finally remembered that night when Groudon received all the rewards he deserved. That night changed the course of everyone's lives. The young man brought the little girl with him, and the determination in his eyes. He is an envoy sent by the heavens to raise a flag for everyone. When people gather under this flag, everything will change. Yuta suddenly remembered a passage in the Pale poem that described the Azure Knight. She felt that this passage was very apparent. A few hundred years ago, this passage was also used to describe the late King Eric. The defensive spells of the Type 4 hunters only managed to buy them a brief moment of respite. As the second and third beams of light converged on a single point, the magical defenses quickly fell apart. The sturdy rock layer was vaporized by the high temperature, and the metal with a higher melting point was melted into molten steel that seeped out from within. The scene resembled the egg white that flowed out of a broken eggshell, but this egg white was a dazzling golden red and had a temperature of hundreds or even thousands of degrees. When the red-hot metal flowed onto the sand immediately crystallized and formed a smooth layer. In less than a minute, the beams of light disappeared one after another. When the last beam of light disappeared, the arena was dead silent. Smoke curled up from most of the crystallized sand. The destroyed, charred rock fortresses stood lifelessly on one side of the arena. There were no survivors. The Type 4 hunters had all melted into a pile of metal debris in their own graves. Even Medisha, who was on the battlefield, was shocked. The elven princess looked up at the rows of holy swords in the sky, and then looked at Brando. "Did we pass just like that, my lord?" She could not help but ask softly. "What else do you want?" Brando shrugged in annoyance. Judging from her tone, it seems like she still thinks it's not enough. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a planeswalker, these 30 over Type 4 hunter riders would have given him a hard time. But he put down his hand, feeling that it was too good to be in control like this. The only pity was that the attack power of the holy swords was still a little too low. The 3 beams of light combined almost couldn't penetrate the silver pinnacle defense. The arena was silent. It seemed that Brando's actions had made the builder of the sanctum feel embarrassed. The sudden silence made the young man secretly alert. He knew that the arena of destiny was not without the possibility of tailor-made difficulty. Because this place was built on a material foundation, in the words of the players, it was actually a kind of pain in the ass to challenge oneself. But after a moment of silence, a voice suddenly sounded in his mind. 3 challenges completed. Additional rewards received. Brando was stunned. I almost forgot about that. He couldn't help but want to slap his forehead. He had always been clear about the rules of the Arena of Destiny in the Amber Sword. The first challenge here was often mandatory, and although the second challenge was optional, there were no benefits. And only after 2 challenges, the player had the right to choose to challenge the core reward. The number of challenges required for the core reward was 2, which meant that if a person wanted to complete this dungeon, they would have to challenge it at least 4 times. And at most there was no upper limit. Of course, the so-called core reward here was the Halran Gaia. Brando looked in that direction. If he wanted to get that sword, he would have to go through at least 2 challenges. And there was an additional rule here. That was, from the 3rd time onwards, every successful challenge would receive additional rewards. The rewards would get better and better, and even have the possibility of surpassing the core reward. But it was said that it would take at least 30 challenges. But that was a rule that players found out in the later stages of the game. Now Brando didn't even dare to think about it. Do you want to receive the reward? Brando looked at the row of fluorescent words that appeared on his retina, and answered in his mind, of course. Please select your interface. Another row of words appeared. Brando was slightly stunned. He had never heard of such a thing as selecting an interface. He thought for a moment, and then continued to read. Sure enough, the green text changed again. General Interface. Planeswalker Interface. Huh? Brando was dumbfounded. He had never heard of a game where there would be additional choices for quest rewards due to a change in class. Although there were different rewards for some quests, there was one point, and that was that they were originally there. They were not extra rewards after you advanced into a certain class. He looked at the two options and hesitated for a moment, but in the end he decided to give it a try. Planeswalker interface. The scene changed again. Last night I forgot to turn off the air conditioner when I went to sleep, and you all know the result. I'll be leaving today's update. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 307. The green text that was projected on his retina disappeared. Brando immediately saw a floating screen in front of him. To be exact, it was a roulette. Every engraving on the roulette corresponded to the painting of a card. He was slightly startled and understood the meaning of this thing. There were 170 slots in the outer circle of the roulette, and the cards were all ordinary bronze cards that corresponded to the elemental colors. There were 40 slots in the inner circle, and there was a layer of silver light on the surface of the cards. It was a rare silver card. However, the inner circle was now gray. Obviously, for some reason, it did not meet the requirements to unlock it. Brando's gaze returned to the outer circle. He looked at the cards one by one and found the one that he thought was the best. It was the Earth Elemental card Bleeding Altar, in the north direction. A Bleeding Altar, Wolf's Lair 3/25 Earth, 200 mana, enchantment. Lair you can sacrifice 5 gray creatures and summon Futize the Earth Dragon into the field. Creature, Dragon Viper, level 50 boss. Whether Futize dies or the enchantment is destroyed, this card will enter the graveyard. When Futize is in the field, 1 gray creature must be sacrificed every day to maintain it. Not far away, a low roar came from the cave. Another card also caught his attention. Gem Plane Scenic Wonder 6. Special land, plane tap, 2 light into your elemental pool. Tap, pay 2 light, gain 20 wealth. No one knows what kind of natural gifts are left under the grass. This card was even more attractive to Brando than the first one because both the light element and wealth were resources that he urgently needed. Especially the former. He had no way to replenish it. On the contrary, he had a large number of cards that required the light element. For example, the Golden Battle Flag 5 light, Sunblade 5 light, Pristine Archangel 5 light, and even the Archangel had to pay an additional maintenance fee for every day it was in the field. Since the night of the Battle of Abes, Brando had been using the light elemental pool as a part-time elementalist. Although he had been trying his best to save the little resources he had, he was only left with 6 or 7 light elemental pools. If he could get that card, his current predicament would be completely changed. He believed anyone would be able to see the difference between a one-time consumption and a sustainable use at a glance. Needless to say, the role of wealth was so important that it didn't need to be reiterated. But in fact, Brando would discover that he was not only lacking in wealth and light element. If he had carefully examined all the resources he had as a planeswalker, he would have realized that he didn't live up to his name. He had a total of 19 cards in his hand, including the event card, Wolf's Lair, which had already been used. Among them there were 4 treasure cards: Holy Sword, Golden Battle Flag, Silver Colt and Eternal Orb, 5 creature cards: Highland Squire, Wind Spirit Spider, Mercenary of Lopez, Unicorn Knight, Pristine Archangel. 1 resource card, Rich Gold Mine. 3 spell cards, Energy Drain, Sunblade, Sprint Drive. 5 land cards: Sacred Tree, Secret Grounds, Ruagen Swamp, The Shire Market of Roe, Storm Lair, Ember Volcano. Event card: Wolf's Denver. 19 cards, not even half of a deck of cards. According to Tuman, a deck of cards must have at least 40 cards to be called a deck, and only such a deck could be freely switched in battle. In other words, if this wasn't Brando's first deck of cards, he wouldn't even have the basic qualifications to have 40 cards. In other words, he was just like a sorcerer's apprentice. At most, he was an unofficial planeswalker's apprentice. In theory, his 5 land cards could provide him with 2 nature, 1 water, 1 dark, 1 earth, 2 wind and 1 fire. In addition, there would be an additional 1 water, 1 dark, 1 wind and 1 fire every week. But the truth was that the rich gold mine was attached to the hidden grounds of the Holy Tree. In order to ensure the normal operation of the gold mine and maintain the more important wealth, the card of the hidden grounds of the Holy Tree was not used most of the time, and only provided 1 water EP per week. Fortunately, he only had the Shire as his water element card, And he didn't have any green cards, so at least he didn't feel that it was too difficult. But according to Tumen, nature cards had the best summon creatures of all cards, and Brando knew that he would have to face this problem sooner or later. In terms of financial income, he owned the market of the Shire of Roe and the rich gold mine. One was 8 wealth, the other was 4 wealth, a total of 12 wealth per day. But what he needed to pay was Unicorn Night card 6 wealth 1 dark day. Lucas's Mercenary 2 wealth per day. Highland Squire 1 earth day. Pristine Archangel 1 light day. It could be seen that under normal circumstances, Brando's dark and earth elements were equivalent to having no income every day. Dark elements were still fine because Medisha usually had a hard time entering the graveyard. But earth elements were necessary for Brando's other powerful card combination, Wind Spirit Spiders Holy Sword, and the consumption wasn't just a little bit. Usually it would take half a month to store enough for one battle. In order to save earth elements, Brando would rather shuffle the Shire back into the deck and summon it again every day. This was because summoning the Highland Squire only required 1 water, but maintaining the presence of the Highland Squire required 1 earth. But this wasn't without its disadvantages. First of all, he couldn't obtain the 1 reputation that the Highland Squire provided every day. Secondly, Brando's water element storage was decreasing day by day. His original plan of living off his previous savings would soon lead to the crisis of the elemental pool. In Brendel's opinion, this kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul situation did not make him a qualified planeswalker. And before this, he had never regarded this class as his biggest reliance. Of course, it was more than enough as an additional support. But Brando could faintly feel the potential of the planeswalker class. He thought that perhaps this class would bring him a huge surprise in the future, or even become a life-saving asset. But he also understood that it would require an even larger deck to support it. This process was very long, but the prospects that were presented were very tempting. So when Brando saw the roulette, he couldn't help but say, "Interesting." He immediately tapped on the screen with some anticipation, hoping to get the card he wanted. The roulette immediately spun, and Brando's gaze was nervous and motionless. But after a few seconds the needle slowed down. It first swept across the gem plane, which made Brando's heart tighten slightly. He was a little disappointed, but he immediately saw that the needle was approaching the north from the other side. At this moment the arena was silent. Everyone saw Brando standing there motionlessly, frowning as he focused his gaze on an infinite distance in front of him. "My lord." Medisha turned her head and asked softly, but Brando turned a deaf ear. He saw that the needle was slowly passing the bleeding altar, and couldn't help but shout in his heart, "Stop! Stop!" But the disobedient needle still slid a little, just a little, but the card's appearance changed. Fireclaw Spearman, Flame Tribe 2, 15 Fire Creature. Fireclaw Lizard Warrior, level 27 Creature Warlike. Place a company of Fireclaw Spearmen into the arena. When a Fireclaw Spearman is in the arena, pay 5 fortune per day. There's the smell of enemies in the flames. "Lady Martha, don't be like this," Brando shouted in his heart, but he didn't show it. Instead, he watched as the roulette disappeared, and then a fiery red card floated from the air into his hand. Brando looked at the card. It was a drawing of a lizardman warrior. But unlike the lizardmen of Wond, these lizardmen with crimson scales were obviously much stronger. They wore simple metal armor, and 2 arm-length spears hung from their backs and waists. But what caught Brendel's attention was the lizardmen's golden prismatic pupils. Among the reptiles in Vaunt, those with golden pupils were a symbol of the dragon's bloodline, and it was a lesser dragon species that was very close to it. It seemed that these Fireclaw lizardmen's individual combat strength was only at the peak of Iron rank, but their background was not simple. In other words, their ancestors were once rich. Thus, the warlike attribute on the card was easy to understand. Dragons were famous for their warlike nature, and Brando didn't know anything else except this attribute. He knew that some monsters in the Amber Sword had a warlike attribute, which meant that when these monsters attacked or were injured, they would gain a morale bonus. This bonus wasn't easy to understand, but according to Brando's rough estimation, every morale bonus was equivalent to a 10% increase in overall combat strength. Overall, this buff was quite unobtainable, but this card made Brando feel a little uncomfortable. He felt that he needed a resource card, not a creature card. Not to mention that the summoning cost of the Fireclaw Spearman was as high as 15 fire, and the cost of maintaining it was close to the cost of the Unicorn Knight, but this card was inferior to the latter in every aspect. He flipped the card over and over again, and when he saw the sentence put a company of Fireclaw Spearmen into play, he calmed down a little. According to Madara's calculations, a company of 30 people, and Erwin's company of 100 people. He didn't know how these Fireclaw Lizardmen were organized, but Brando felt that it shouldn't be too much of a scam. When the card was in his hand, it was not unsealed. With a slight thought, the card disappeared from his hand and entered his deck. This scene naturally fell into the eyes of Medisha and the other youths, but Koden, who was facing away from him, didn't see this subtle movement. My lord! Medisha was also a summon creature, but she didn't understand how Brando got a card out of nowhere. Brando regained his senses and quickly replied, "It's just a reward. Let's continue the challenge." "Do you still want to continue the challenge?" The Silver Fairy Princess was stunned. Brando looked at the sword in the center of the arena and nodded. Ever since he lost the Thorn of Light, he had always wanted to find a suitable weapon, and he didn't want to give up this opportunity no matter what. Moreover, the Haurangaya was indeed tempting. Thus, when the loud voice sounded for the third time in the arena, "Mortal, do you want to continue your challenge?" Brando nodded without hesitation. "I want to proceed with the advancement challenge." The young man looked at the Haurangaya on the stone tablet and replied. The arena fell silent. Then, under everyone's astonished gazes, a huge cage slowly rose from the other side of the sand. A huge monster was locked in the cage, and everyone promptly shut their mouths. It was a dragon. Author's note: please support me. 1. In the promise, Mansion said to Qingcheng, "Cecilia Chung, you will never get true love, and even if you do, you will lose it immediately." 2. Wu Huan Nicholas Tsai said to Qingcheng, "Cecilia Chung, you have ruined my chance to be a good person." 3. Qingcheng Cecilia Chung said to the millions of soldiers, "Do you want to see me take off my clothes?" Now, hundreds of millions of people around the world have seen it. 4. Chun Kaiga said, "You don't understand the promise now, but you will in the future." Chapter 308. To be more precise, it was a lesser dragon. When the draconic beast landed on the ground, it was as majestic as a fortress. Its color was sky green, and the edges of its scales reflected a cold light like steel. Each scale was a few inches thick, and from afar, it looked as if it was covered in a layer of metal. However, the draconic beast's true characteristic was its ugly, angular, triangular head. Its deep eye sockets had a pair of motionless, pale blue eyes. The only thing that stood out about the draconic beast was the golden flame of the draconic beast's descendant, the draconic wind Aedra. In front of the adult draconic beast, Cerberus was as obedient as a puppy. The draconic wind Aedra was at the top of the food chain in the mountain of quelling storms. The natives of that country called it the overlord of the wind. Legend had it that the draconic wind Aedra was the descendant of the sky dragon, the dragon of calamity. However, in Brando's previous life, the Royal Society of Naturalists in the Cruz Empire had already refuted this theory. The draconic wind Aedra was the descendant of the sky dragon, but it was different from the elves in the clouds. It was more of a savage predator, and the blood that flowed in its body was not the cold blood of the elements, but the warm blood of the wild. However, no matter what kind of blood it had, it would not be affected by the draconic wind Aedra's name. Even if the draconic wind Aedra in front of Brando was just an immature youth, it still had the strength of an upper gold. Damn it! Brando cursed in his heart. The draconic wind Aedra's true strength was that it was immune to all air spells. The Arena of Destiny must have scanned the wind spirit spiders before releasing this draconic wind spirit spiders. The draconic wind spirit spiders could be said to be one of their biggest natural enemies. This was blatant cheating. If it was in the past, Brando would have immediately disconnected and run to the forum to curse the designer. However, he could only accept it now. Fortunately, it seemed that the Arena of Destiny could only scan the draconic wind spirit spiders, and not the other cards attached to it. This was because the attack attribute of the Holy Sword cards came from the Earth element, which was the most effective against air element creatures. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but be filled with the pleasure of revenge. However, unlike Brando's rich and colorful thoughts at the moment, When the others saw this mountain-like monster, they did not have many thoughts in their minds. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air, and a kind of fear that seemed to tighten their heartstrings grew in their hearts. Even those who hadn't been out of Schaflund since they were young could at least recognize what kind of item it was. Dragons. Although they might not be able to tell the difference between the real dragons, sub-dragons, secondary dragons, and flying lizards in the Amber Sword, they undoubtedly had one thing in common, and that was that they all played the role of the final boss in legends or bedtime stories. Everyone grew up listening to the legends of dragons, whether it was the mythical dragons such as Dusk and Darkness, the sky dragons such as Azure, Blazing, and Crystal, or the fire-breathing dragons on the ground. There were too many stories to describe the power of these creatures. Moreover, as the last of the golden dragons on the ground, they had the blood of mystery and nobility flowing in their veins. Joka, Mar, and Cohen held their breaths. Even Yuta, Scarlet, and Coden were stunned. They recognized Erwin's pterosaur as a military flying beast, but it was definitely not this thing. This was a gigantic beast that shone with a blue and green light. Its wings were like blades that cut the metal cage into pieces. So this is a dragon? They all thought at the same time. The only one who reacted was Mar. Perhaps he was born a little careless. He suddenly pushed Cohen aside and whispered, He's challenging us again. Is he going to save us? Cohen didn't say a word. He looked at the dragon, his heart pounding nervously even though he knew that they weren't its target. But in front of such a gigantic beast, ordinary people couldn't help but feel small. It was as if the dragon could easily kill them with a flap of its wings. Of course, it wasn't unreasonable to think that way. But even if the Adra Wyrm was 100 times stronger, it still wouldn't be able to destroy the protective barrier around the arena. Cohen! Shut up! Cohen raised his voice for the first time. He frowned and shook his head. Although the Adra Wind Dragon had attracted his attention, he was still thinking about the scene from before. That detail made his heart skip a beat. He put his hand into his pocket and pressed down on something. The Adra Wyrm. Medisha tensed up. She pursed her lips and stared at the dragon with her silver eyes. She couldn't help but tighten her grip on the silver shuttle in her hand. No matter what, the Adra Wyrm was an upper gold tier monster. My lord, even though the Adra Wyrm looks big and clumsy, it's actually very fast and agile, the silver elf princess whispered. Before she could finish her sentence, the Adra Wyrm suddenly spread its wings and soared into the sky. It was so fast that Brando could only see a faint green trail of its movement. By the time the young man realized what was going on, the Adra Wyrm had already turned around and charged into the swarm of wind spirit spiders. The Adra Wyrm was very familiar with these little creatures, but the holy swords on their bodies made it feel like Damocles was hanging over its head. The Adra Wyrm's instincts were not wrong, but Brando's summoned creatures were in trouble. In the blink of an eye, the Adra Wyrm noticed that a large part of its holy sword array was missing. Spread out. Shoot at will. Brando was so anxious that he immediately gave the order. 2 Earth EP was drained from his elemental pool, and a large golden net appeared in the sky. But what happened next was something that Brando would never forget. He looked up and saw the Adra Wyrm swimming in and out of the net like a fish. More than 70% of the light beams missed the Adra Wyrm's body, and only a few hit the scales of the Adra Wyrm. It was as if the air was not an obstacle but another pair of wings for the Adra Wyrm. It wasn't just the young lord who was shocked. Everyone else was shocked as well. Even though it happened in the blink of an eye, it felt like 10,000 years had passed in everyone's eyes. The Adra Wyrm seemed to be moving in slow motion in the air. It rolled and the light beams missed its wings. It dodged left and right as if it was so slow that even the naked eye could follow its movements. But the holy sword cards just couldn't hit it. The illusion disappeared in a blink of an eye. The Adra Wyrm had passed through the net of light, and was now in front of another group of wind spirit spiders. This was the strength of a gold-ranked wind elemental creature. As expected of a creature from the wind elemental realm, Brando felt an inexplicable sense of beauty in his heart. He had heard of the wind elemental realm from the players before, but this was the first time he saw it with his own eyes. The Adra Wyrm's speed left a deep impression on him. They are the descendants of the Cloud Elves. They really live up to their name. Legend had it that the blue dragons were the ones who flew in the clouds. Their speed was comparable to that of light and lightning, but it was clear that their descendants were not inferior to them. Brando didn't have much time to think about it. If it was a gold-ranked creature on the ground, he, Medisha, and the wind spirit spiders would have a chance. But this time the arena of destiny was giving him a hard time. Fortunately, this problem was not unsolvable for him. He took a step back and shouted, "Medisha, summon the unicorn." "Yes, my lord." The silver elf princess grabbed her spear and jumped up. The spirit unicorn immediately jumped out of a door of light that appeared out of thin air, allowing the girl to land on the saddle behind it. After one person and one horse became one, Medisa immediately rode the unicorn and soared into the sky to kill the wind dragon. Although the Audiobook was as fast as lightning, the unicorn was not inferior to it. Unicorns were creatures with extremely powerful individual combat strength. Only silver elves could accompany them and make them willing to become mounts. Unicorns were a level 11 organization of the silver elves, and their individual combat strength was close to the peak of gold. Among them, the elderly had even activated their elemental powers. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that Medisha was the only one who could fight in the Unicorn Knight card, her unicorn would be far more powerful than her. Of course, Brando knew that the rules of this card were limited. The only thing that the unicorn she rode on was its speed. But that was enough. The Audiobook immediately sensed a threat approaching from behind. Although Medisha was only at the beginning of gold, if it exposed its back, it would suffer the same fate as Coden. It had no choice but to give up on the wind spirit spiders and turn around to face the silver elf princess. Both sides crossed each other in the sky. The Audiobook had suffered a great loss from Medisa's counterattack, but even so, the one who was injured was Medisa. The Audiobook used its claws to push away Medisha's spear and clawed back to force her away. The Audiobook then took the upper hand. The whole process was done in one go, and it was unscathed. Even though the silver elf princess managed to dodge the fatal blow with the speed of her royal unicorn, the air currents around the Audiobook still managed to inflict multiple wounds on her body and armor. This air current was one of the characteristics of high-grade wind elementals. The craftsman of Galbu even created a spell called Air Shield. However, compared to the original version, this spell only retained the defensive side. As for the offensive side, the girl on the unicorn touched her cheek. Her palm was covered in pale silver blood. She looked up and a hint of caution flashed in her eyes. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 309. The wind spirit spiders in the sky launched another volley of attacks. Golden beams of light crisscrossed in the sky, forming a magnificent net of light. Brando still had 3 Earth EP left in his elemental pool, but he immediately tapped the Shire of Rhodes and allowed the Holy Sword card to attack twice in the next 15 minutes. The Holy Sword's attack was not very effective. A single beam of light could barely penetrate the outer layer of the Audiobook's magic defense, let alone penetrate its thick scales. The Audiobook's speed was too fast for the wind spirit spiders to catch up to it. Brando realized that the wind spirit spiders and the Holy Sword combination had another fatal weakness. The Holy Sword's accuracy was dependent on the wind spirit spider's attributes. However, the wind spirit spider's levels were too low. Their dexterity and perception were too low, and their intelligence was too low. Although the number of wind spirit spiders could make up for this weakness, the remaining 100 wind spirit spiders in the sky were not enough to deal with the Audiobook. The wind spirit spider's speed was at least 300%. Even with Medisha's help, the wind spirit spiders could barely contain the Audiobook. Brando stared at the battle in the sky and took a step back. Another card appeared in his hand, the silver horse. He threw the card to the center of the battlefield and drew a magic circle on the ground. A shining silver horse leaped out of the circle. He knows how to summon. One of the young men shouted. Their eyes shone brightly. This battle was beyond their understanding. In their minds, if the Audiobook was the most terrifying monster in the world, then Brando and Medisha were the most powerful people in the world. On the other hand, the old man did not express his opinion. Coden's attention was completely focused on the battle taking place on the battlefield. The November War might have been more gruesome and cruel, but it was not as magnificent as this one. On the battlefield it was a battle of flesh and blood. But here the battle was nothing more than a golden net in the sky. A dragon and a unicorn knight. The battle was filled with a kind of fantasy, and it also evoked the old swordsman's memories of the time when he was young and passionate. He touched the Wind Empress ring on his index finger, feeling a little emotional. Brando had already mounted his horse. He patted the silver horse's neck, and it immediately turned into a streak of light and charged towards the Audiobook. The young man activated his charge skill in midair, and the speed of one man and one horse instantly caught up with Medusa's royal unicorn. With his sword in hand, he aimed at the wind dragon's belly, which was the weakest part of any dragon. Moreover, the wind dragon was a wild subspecies of dragon, unlike many of the second-generation dragons who were enslaved by the humans and wore chest and abdomen armor. The Audiobook sensed the threat coming from below and blocked Medusa's spear with one of its wings. It then turned its body in the air and swept its tail towards Brando. The Audiobook's tail whistled through the air like a banshee's wail as it swept past Brando's head. The sharp air current around the tail cut off a strand of Brando's hair. The young man ducked to avoid the attack, but he also lost the opportunity to attack. The Audiobook took advantage of the opportunity and swooped down towards Brando. A streak of azure lightning flashed across the sky. "Oh!" Jana heard Scarlet's worried cry from behind her. She realized that she had unknowingly gripped the iron bars tightly. The mercenary leader let go of her hand awkwardly, but the battle in the sky still made her feel uneasy. She looked up anxiously. The Audiobook's strength was beyond her imagination. However, Brando, who was under attack, did not think much of it. Brando had never fought an Audiobook before, but he was quite familiar with the flying lizards. He did not hesitate to tighten the reins of the silver horse and stopped in midair. He then whispered an order to the silver elf girl. Medusa, who was chasing after the Audiobook, looked up and saw Brando's eyes from afar. She immediately understood what he meant. Brando raised his sword, and the wind spirit spiders around him received the order. They immediately attacked the area between him and the Audiobook. The intertwining beams of light blocked the path of the Audiobook that was swooping down towards Brando. The Audiobook paused in midair, and at that moment, it was as if the wind in the air had stopped. The net of light became brighter and brighter, and even the Audiobook and Brando could not see each other through the blinding light. The Audiobook flapped its wings and could not move forward. Brando took a breather and checked his elemental pool. There were only 2 Earth EP left. He patted the silver warhorse's neck and allowed it to dive through the net of light. At the same time, another card of fate appeared in the young man's hand. The Audiobook on the other side of the net did not see Brando's actions. In fact, it had a bigger problem to deal with. The wind spirit spider's sudden attack had stopped it in midair. However, the price of being interrupted was fatal. Even though it was only for a moment, Medusa and her royal unicorn still managed to catch up to the Audiobook. Strike of 1,000 armies. Medusa held the silver spear in her hand tightly and thrust it forward. Her petite body was filled with terrifying power. Her spear, her horse, and her spear pierced through the air. The silver line pierced through the Audiobook in an instant, causing it to let out an anguished wail that shook the entire arena. Although it tried to dodge the amazing spear at the last moment, the Silver Elf Princess Knight's spear produced a strong suction force in the vacuum area and pulled it back. The spear first pierced through the Audiobook's outer layer of magical defense. Then, it parted the sharp air current and shattered the blue scales on the Audiobook's back. Blue blood burst out in the air and fell like rain. However, it evaporated halfway and formed a light blue cloud in the air. This was one of the main characteristics of air elementals. Air elementals were made up of wind elementals. When the wind elementals dissipated, they would return to the world in a free state. The Audiobook almost lost consciousness due to the excruciating pain. The strike of 1,000 armies was a slow but powerful elven battle technique. Even though Medusa was 2 ranks lower than the Audiobook, she was still able to inflict serious damage to it. While the Audiobook was falling, Brando and the silver warhorse had already passed through the light blue clouds in the same direction. He looked up at the Audiobook that was falling towards him and raised the card in his hand. "Show me." he shouted. The card in his hand depicted a group of charging knights. As soon as Brando let go of the card, it flew into the air and emitted a blinding light. Card of Fate. Sprint Drive enters the arena. Planeswalker pays 2 Earth Elementals. Summoner and Unicorn Knight receive Link ability. Shared power and shared damage. At that moment, Brendel felt his strength increase exponentially, more than doubling in an instant. He activated the Crystal of the Ghost Knight and activated Power Burst. In a split second, the exchange ratio between stamina and Power Burst was pushed to the highest level. It seemed like a simple slash, but the White Raven Sword style's wind blade instantly shot out. When the wind pressure compressed the air to form a sharp current, the distorted airflow refracted the light and instantly drew a crescent-shaped arc of light with a vertical width of nearly 30 meters in the air. The arc of light moved forward and expanded further, covering half of the sky under a 100-meter-long crack. Time seemed to have stopped for a moment as the sword splendor that flickered with a faint silver light stretched across the sky. In the eyes of everyone who looked up at this scene, it was like a sword that tore through space. Mid-level gold. At that moment, the old man froze like a stone statue. He did not know what kind of sorcery Brendel had used, but the young man's strength had skyrocketed in such a short period of time. The scene of him breaking through to the gold-ranked realm was real. Even in the entire world of Wond, it was rare to see such a sudden breakthrough. At that moment, Coden could not help but associate Brando with the rare golden bloodline. He could not help but wonder if the stubborn Tobu's ancestor came from a family with a long history. With a loud bang, the Aedra Wind Dragon landed in the middle of the arena, stirring up a cloud of dust. Everyone felt the floor shake, but no one said anything. Everyone, including Scarlet and Yuta, were stunned. Not only was the intensity of the battle far beyond their imagination, but the speed of the battle was also far beyond their imagination. From the moment the Aedra Wind Dragon was sent flying to the moment it was killed by Brando and Medisha, only half a minute had passed. After a long while, the young miners finally heaved a sigh of relief. After the battle, the arena was filled with a strange silence. On one hand, they were subconsciously recalling the battle, but on the other hand, they were hoping that Brando would help them. Unfortunately, they were disappointed. Brendel did not even look at the screen as he continued to draw the lottery. This time, the young man got what he wished for. When the green text disappeared from his retina, a gray card fell into his hand. Plain Brando clenched his fist, his heart filled with satisfaction. He looked down at the arena and said, "Prepare for the last battle, Medisha." "Yes, my lord." The silver elf girl leaned over and lowered her head. "The next match will be the arena battle." Brendel thought to himself as he knew the rules of the Arena of Destiny. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 310. Ouch! The young girl's cry of pain came from the dark tunnel. The dwarf, who had just climbed out of the tunnel, had no choice but to turn his head back. He saw little Roman holding her forehead with both hands and walking out from below with tears in her eyes. "What's wrong?" The dwarf slapped the merchant girl's left hand away, and saw that there was a red patch on the young Roman's forehead. He glared at her and said, "Why did you bump into it again? Didn't I tell you before? This tunnel is specially dug for me, so of course it's shorter than yours." Odom grumbled unwillingly. "That's why you have to be careful when you go in and out. But you didn't say anything after that." The young Roman held her head and frowned as she muttered, "You don't have to keep reminding me, little girl." The dwarf sighed and pulled her out of the tunnel. "All right, how is it? Does it still hurt, little one?" "Of course it hurts," she replied without hesitation. "You have to bear with it even if it hurts. We dwarves won't make a sound even if we bump into a metal plate." Odom stood on the slope and looked down. It was the path into the mine. "All right, we're here. Quickly put on your scarf." But the Roman was more interested in the first part of the dwarf's sentence. "Really?" She widened her eyes. "Won't make a sound even if we bump into a metal plate? That?" "Of course." The dwarf suddenly saw the disbelief on her face and glared at her. "What a joke! Little girl, a dwarf of my age has a beard that's longer than your hair. Do you think I'll lie to you?" But he immediately opened his mouth when he saw the young Roman rummaging through her backpack with interest before taking out a black object. "What's this?" Odom asked curiously. "It's a metal plate." Why don't you give it a try?" the merchant girl asked curiously. "TSK, why would a dwarf like me do something so boring?" The dwarf's expression changed. "Come to think of it, little girl, why do you have this in your backpack?" However, his expression immediately became strange. Romaine tilted her head and looked at him with a smile. She placed a finger on her cheek and said, "Shame on you, you're bragging." Auntie really didn't lie to the Roman. She said that dwarves love to brag. "Who said that?" Odom flew into a rage and waved his fist, but he suddenly remembered that she was just a girl. As a dwarf of his age, he did not want to argue with the aunt of a little girl. In the end he coughed and said, "Ahem, who told you that?" "Let me tell you, little one. Only witches would say that." Odom did not know that his words had come true, but after thinking about it, he decided to maintain his dignity. "The reason why I didn't try is because there's no need to. Do you know that this is a mining area? We're sneaking in here. It'll be bad if we make any noise and get discovered." "Really?" "Of course. Little guy, do you think an old man like me would lie to you? I'm different from those cunning humans." But before he could finish, he heard a low shout from outside the forest. "Who's in there?" Odom's words were stuck in his throat. He turned his head stiffly and saw that there was a group of patrolling cavalry on the road outside the forest. His conversation with the Roman was too loud and they were obviously discovered. "Oh no." Odom frowned and put his stubby finger to his lips and made a shoe gesture to the Roman. "Don't make a sound." He seemed to be afraid that the little Roman would not understand and added another sentence. But the merchant girl seemed to understand, and she nodded obediently. She looked around curiously, as if she was a little excited by the environment. The two stowaways in the forest did not say anything, but that did not mean that the people outside thought that the noise they heard was an illusion. The riders looked at each other and shouted, "The people inside, don't hide anymore. Come out, we've already seen you." They took off their guns and pointed inside. "If you don't come out, we're going to attack." The little Roman immediately looked at the old dwarf. Although she looked a little dazed, she had been through a few battles with Brando, and knew that the knights were not just trying to scare her. She looked at Odom with an interesting gaze. "What should we do next?" But the old dwarf did not have the time to answer Romaine's question. When he heard that the enemy was about to shoot, he immediately stood up from the bushes and raised his hand nervously. "Captain Martyr, it's me, don't fire." The rider who raised his gun was stunned for a moment, but he immediately relaxed. "Odom, so it's you, old man. You sneaked in again. But just in time, Sir Perkins is looking for you." He looked at the Roman and asked curiously, "Who is that?" "Oh, it's a relative of mine." No matter how thick-skinned the old dwarf was, he could not hold it in anymore. But he did not expect to meet these people. "Why is Perkins looking for me?" "Relative?" The riders immediately had a "we understand" expression and laughed. "I didn't expect you to have an illegitimate daughter outside, old man." But the leader of the knights quickly interrupted them. "There's a big mess in the mines and Sir Coden is also in there. Sir Perkins is looking for you because you're the only one who can help him." When the riders mentioned the clerk, it was obvious that they did not have much respect for him. Odom snorted. The Golden Dwarves and Alpine Dwarves were the best miners in the world, apart from the residents of the underworld, of course. As someone who grew up among the Golden Dwarves and had a deep relationship with the Alpine Dwarves, he was able to understand the situation in the Schaflund mines in a short period of time. He did this in order to better realize his plan, but he did not expect that by a stroke of luck, his reputation would soon be discovered by the sissy clerk. This matter actually helped him a lot, and from then on, he obtained a fairly good position in the mining area. There was no need to explain the convenience that came with this position, and it was obvious that Odom liked it. "What's the situation in the mines?" "It seems like someone dug through the lower levels and monsters came out and injured people. But thanks to Martha, it's not my turn to be on duty today." The leader of the riders clearly did not have the self-awareness of a soldier, and he sighed in relief. "As you can see, there's an earthquake and it's a mess inside." Odom's heart skipped a beat when he heard that someone had dug through the lower levels, but he frowned when he heard about the monsters. "Earthquake? he asked. Then how are the tunnels that lead to the underground? Are there any problems with A4, A12 and B3? How's the work of the lift there? Odom was familiar with the Schaflund mines like he was with his own fingerprints, and he immediately sorted out the tunnels that led to the 5th level and were the least likely to be damaged by the earthquake. I'm not sure about that, Mardell shook his head. I don't dare to go in now, so you can ask around yourself. But old man, you're not really going in, are you? You have to think about it carefully. There are monsters down there, and you don't have to risk your life for that, Lord Perkins, do you? Humph, what do you know? Odom replied in annoyance. Of course I don't. I can't wait for you to die, old man. He glanced at the Roman behind him. But don't worry, I'll definitely take care of your illegitimate daughter when the time comes. Scram! Odom shouted angrily. The cavalryman immediately walked away, laughing and laughing. The old dwarf groaned as he turned his head, but his face immediately crumbled when he saw the merchant girl looking at him with an inexplicable expression that was a mixture of curiosity and amusement. It's nothing, old grandpa. The young Roman nodded seriously. Romans understand, Romans won't laugh at anything. Odom was petrified, feeling that his reputation had been destroyed. Brendel and Medisa slowly landed on the sandy ground in the middle of the arena. As they descended, Brendel whispered to the silver elf girl beside him who was walking side by side. Don't worry. Next should be the arena battle. In the arena battle, one side will choose the arena and the rules, so you have to listen to the rules clearly. If you break the rules, you'll be kicked out. Medisha lowered her head and listened carefully. She then nodded and asked softly, My lord, what should Medisha do? Don't worry too much. The rules won't be complicated, and most of them are mandatory. I'm just giving you a reminder. The silver elf girl looked up at her summoner with a hint of curiosity in her pale silver eyes. My lord, you're the most knowledgeable person this Medisha has ever met. She used an elf's unique attitude and praised him softly. Brando was stunned. The knowledge of the Black Tower's wizards comes from Buga of the Silver Alliance. He thought for a moment and explained in a casual manner. Medisha smiled at him and nodded. She thought that the young lord would not explain, but Brando's attitude gave her a pleasant surprise and explained the doubts in her heart. If Brando's knowledge came from the artisan wizards who claimed to have all the knowledge in the world, then everything he knew would not be so strange. The Silver Elves were descendants of the Silver race, but so were the artisan wizards. When the two landed on the ground, everyone's eyes were fixed on them. Brando saw Coden running towards him from the side. The old man ran a few steps before he was stopped by an invisible wall of air. He stood outside the wall and shouted, Kid! Brando raised his eyebrows and looked in that direction. P.S. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. This chapter has been corrected and can be read normally. Chapter 311. Coden looked at the young man sitting on the silver warhorse with a complicated expression. Coden had entered the realm of gold 30 years ago, and he only managed to stabilize his position a few years ago. Yet, this young man seemed to be blessed by the heavens. No, not even a divine one would be able to reach the level of intermediate gold at such a young age, unless he was the chosen one. However, the chosen ones were bound by the shackles of fate. A part of their body was taken away from them, just like the blind Yura. That was why the old swordsman did not even think in that direction when he saw him. He paused for a moment and asked anxiously. Young man, who is your imprinted soul? What? Brando was stunned. Don't play dumb with me. I'm asking you, who is your imprinted soul? You know what I mean. Coden was so angry that he stomped his feet and shouted, This is very important. Tell me. What are you talking about? What do I know? Brando was really stunned this time. He thought that Coden was going to remind him of something, but he did not expect Coden to ask him a series of strange questions. But just as he was about to ask, the loud voice above the arena suddenly rang out again, interrupting their conversation. Mortal, do you wish to continue the challenge? Of course, Brando replied. Kid, answer me. Coden slammed the air wall and shouted. Brando glanced at him and gestured for him to wait. He then looked up and waited for the host to announce the rules. Sure enough, he saw a row of dark green words appear on his retina. Nightmare Arena. The next battlefield is the Nightmare Arena. At the same time, a thunderous voice announced the same thing in everyone's hearts. Brando's expression changed. What is the Nightmare Arena, my lord? Medisha frowned and asked softly. What's the Nightmare Arena, Cohen? Mar turned his head and asked his companion the same question. I don't know. Cohen's answer was simple. What are they arguing about? Joka's attention was on Coden and Brendel. Compared to this strange world, he was more worried about whether they would be able to leave this place safely. I don't know. The same answer. But why does he want to continue the challenge? There's no one left to save. One of the youths asked. I don't think it's that simple, someone replied. Although I don't know where this is, I think it must have cost a lot of money to build such a place. Is it just for a game of catch or release? His words resonated with many of the youths, and they looked at their surroundings worriedly. You don't know what those nobles like. Maybe they just want to have fun. This place might not have been created by those nobles. If I remember correctly, we were at the bottom of the mine. Why do I feel like there's something strange about the thing we dug up? That. I agree. And that was a dragon. How should I put it? I feel like I'm in a dream. I don't even know if it's real. The youth touched the cold iron bars as he spoke. Everyone fell silent. His target is the sword. Cohen's voice was not loud, but he always waited for the youths to finish before he spoke. His words seemed to carry a lot of weight. The skinny youth stared at the black sword on the stone tablet in the middle of the arena. He noticed that Brando had looked in that direction a few times. When he said this, the others immediately felt that it made sense. Then he's not going to save us? Someone asked worriedly. Why would he save us? This was a questioning voice. Cohen. Joka looked at his companion. In his mind, Cohen was the most knowledgeable person he had ever met. Even though he did not like to talk much, he was always insightful. I have an idea, Cohen said softly, but it sounded like he was trying to encourage himself. I'll convince him. How are you going to convince him? Mar asked in confusion. I'll make a deal with him. Mar's eyes widened. You're not going to use your worthless items to make a deal with him, are you? Angering him won't do us any good. Cohen didn't answer. He just silently glanced at his companion. The Nightmare Arena is an extreme mode. No matter how strong you are, you're just an ordinary person. You have to use your skills to defeat your enemies. Skills? Medisha raised her eyebrows. What skills? Brando tapped the blade of his sword. Battle skills. The silver elf girl fell silent as if she was thinking. It sounded like it would benefit them, but she did not think so. Even though her lord did not mention it, she could guess that it would not be so simple. Brando looked up at the sky. Rows of golden words appeared in the sky. There were Dwarven, Ancient Cruz, Tower, Elven, Draconic, and even a language that made Brando's heart skip a beat. He rubbed his nose and pretended that he did not see the familiar words. However, this place was already strange enough that the words that appeared in the sky did not attract much attention. It was as if it was abnormal for an ancient civilization to not have a language that was difficult to understand. Everyone present was more concerned about the content of those words. 1. Power dissipation. Both parties involved in the battle will have their power reduced to less than 10 ounces. 2. Skill dissipation. Both parties involved in the battle will have their power reduced, unless they have a specific skill. 3. Swordsmanship. Only a specific skill is swordsmanship. Janna took a deep breath. Although the young lord's strength had already amazed her, the mercenary commander knew that, unlike the level of strength, just like how seers were born with the power of silver or above, swordsmanship was different. It was a skill that required years of training. Without decades of immersion, no matter how talented a person was, they could not be called a master in swordsmanship. Whether it was in Aween, Kurlutz, or even the whole of Vaunt, those who could be called grandmasters of their generation were mostly old men with white hair who had entered the twilight of their lives. Don't worry, Yuta. Scarlet's voice came from behind. She seemed to have seen the worry in the female commander's heart. However, the red-haired girl seemed to have more confidence in Brando. She just hid her worry deeper in her amber eyes. My lord's swordsmanship is very powerful. I know that my lord's swordsmanship is very powerful. Yuta replied, but she frowned. But we still don't know who my lord's enemy is. She reminded softly. Even in the history of Erewhon, there are many famous swordsmen. Scarlet shivered and could not help but worry. Brando was also worried. His thoughts were actually similar to Scarlet's. The nightmare challenge was not that simple. He was already thinking about which swordsmanship master he would have to face. The young man pressed down on the sword in his hand. Suddenly the light around him dimmed. In the next moment, Metasha, the silver warhorse, and even the wind spirit spiders in the sky disappeared in an instant. There was a low murmur around him. His planeswalker ability was also taken away. Brando immediately felt his scalp go numb. He had hoped that this ability, which had always been like a cheat, could escape the rules, but now it seemed that the planeswalker class was still within the rules of this world. Fortunately, Brando was not so reliant on his planeswalker that he would not be able to fight without it. He only took a light breath to adjust his emotions, and then looked around vigilantly. When the light dimmed, he found himself in an unfamiliar place. The ground was no longer sand but rough granite. The granite was neatly cut into pieces to form a huge field. Brando looked around and saw a black shadow in the north. He narrowed his eyes slightly and recognized the identity of the person behind the shadow. Byuga? Cross-sword Byuga. Koden and Yuta had the same name in their minds. Byuga was quite famous in Erewhon, and his unique swordsmanship style allowed the old swordsman and the mercenary leader to recognize him at a glance. Koden frowned deeply. He had met the talented young man a few years ago, and he knew that he had great swordsmanship. But what made him feel a little relieved was that Torbus's lineage would not be too bad. After all, he was that person's descendant. Janna, on the other hand, looked relieved. She had only seen Byuga from afar once when she was passing through Lantern Island as a mercenary. Of course, she knew his style of swordsmanship, but in her opinion, he was much easier to deal with than those famous swordmasters. However, before the two of them could finish their little calculations, another black shadow appeared on the scene. Brando cursed in his heart, because it was an old acquaintance, the White Knight Ebden. Then came the third black shadow. Brando also recognized that person, Viscount Turst. The fourth black shadow. Brando could feel sweat dripping down his forehead. He could not be more familiar with this figure, and he almost threw the longsword in his hand away. Standing directly south of him was his grandfather, Torbus. Koden's expression changed. That's... Yuta's expression also changed. She felt like something was stuck in her throat, and she wanted to say something but she could not make a sound. Ha! Ha! Harrisgron. Who is that? She frowned and asked in confusion. Yuta looked back at her with a strange expression. She wanted to say something but she could not. But Brando was not in the mood to care about these things. He realized that he was about to face a big problem. 1 against 4. Martha above. Yes. This chapter has been edited and can be read normally. Chapter 312. In terms of strength alone, Brando felt that Byuga was the strongest, followed by Turst, Ebden and his grandfather. But if they were to be ranked based on swordsmanship, his grandfather and Byuga would be at the top, followed by Ebden, and Turst would be at the bottom. He had fought Turst before and knew that his swordsmanship was fast, but speed was dependent on his body's attributes. The rules of the Nightmare Arena were the most restrictive for Turst. Brando looked at his opponents and decided to start with the weakest one. Even so, the situation was not looking good. But once a challenge was chosen, it was impossible to give up halfway. Brando knew that he had to give it his all. The arena was completely silent. The spectators outside all realized that Brando was in a bad situation. 1 against 4, and they were not weak. In fact, they could even say that they were very strong. Even an idiot could see that the situation was not good for him. Koden, who had been slapping the air wall, was also stunned by the sudden development. He put himself in Brendel's shoes and couldn't help but think that he wouldn't be able to win either. That old bastard Tabuz alone could beat him 10 times over. He could only hope that the old man would be merciful on account of the fact that the other party was his grandson. But then again, he knew that it was just a projection of this strange place. Careful! Suddenly, one of the youths shouted. Everyone saw that Terst, who was behind Brendel, was the first to move. His speed was not fast, but the path he chose was very ingenious. It was at a place where Brendel could not see him. But the warning came at the right time. Brando's eyes twitched, and he swung his sword behind his back, allowing Terst's sword to slide to the side. Brando felt that Terst was less of a threat than he thought. Without the suppression of his strength, Terst's swordsmanship was only a so-so. He was about the same level as a level 34 player in the early stages of the game. Terst's entire body slid forward along with the sword, and Brendel's right hand pushed the Viscount's hand away. He then leaned back and struck Terst's armpit with a backhand strike, sending him flying away. Brendel wanted to give chase, but Ebden blocked his path with green flames burning in his eyes. At the same time, Buga also arrived. Damn! Brendel cursed in his heart. He did not dare to fight with the two of them at the same time. That was simply seeking his own death. He quickly stopped to avoid Ebden's vertical slash, then immediately rolled to the side to increase the distance between him and the two of them. The White Knight didn't seem to appreciate it. The undead knight swung his sword horizontally and vertically, and a cross-shaped gust of wind swept towards Brando. Madara's undead battle formation's cross-slash focused on power and speed, and because it was a rare long-ranged attack, it was used to chase after the enemy. Brendel knew this, and he rolled backwards while pressing his hand against the ground, and his entire body spun 270 degrees around the center, dodging the attack that would have been fatal to many people. The cross-shaped gust of wind created by the cross-slash hit the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. However, Brando didn't have the time to see how powerful Ebden's strike was, because the undead knight had caught up to him again. The young man couldn't take it anymore. He half-squatted on the ground and raised his sword to block Ebden's next strike. Using the ground as a counterattack, he tried to counterattack. Unfortunately, before he could unleash the killing intent that he had accumulated, a heavy greatsword came out from the side and destroyed his intentions. It was Buga's sword. Brando deeply felt the helplessness of fighting against so many enemies at once. He was stuck in a situation where he couldn't advance or retreat. He had to block Ebden's attack from above, and there was no way he could dodge this attack from the side. The dangerous situation at that moment even caused many people at the side of the arena to cover their mouths and let out silent cries of surprise. In the eyes of most people, the young man had no other choice but to abandon his sword and retreat. But what about after abandoning his sword? Under the encirclement of 4 people, it was still a big question whether he could take his sword back. Brando's counterattack was out of everyone's expectations. He didn't abandon his sword and retreat because he didn't forget that he still had 3 swords on his waist. Brando raised his right hand and pulled out one of the swords from his left hand. At the critical moment, he blocked Buga's sword with a clang. However, the strength of his left hand was not as strong as his right hand. Even though Buga's greatsword was disrupted, it still brushed past the young man's cheek. Brando immediately felt a cold pain on his cheek. F***ck. Don't hit my face when you hit someone. He cursed in his heart. Even though he cursed, Brando's actions were not slow. After Buga's sword passed by him, the young man immediately used the counterforce to push forward. With a frontal assault and a burst of strength, Brando directly broke through Ebden's defense and sent it flying. Unfortunately, charge wasn't a swordsmanship skill, or else Brando knew that he had the best chance to pursue. Ebden fell into the sand, and Buga didn't have the time to stop his attack. If it was a normal person, Brando might have done so, but he wasn't. Madara's military swordsmanship was based on the principle of exchanging wounds for wounds. The undead were truly fearless when they fought with their lives on the line. Of course, they didn't have lives in the first place. As expected, when Brando slightly moved forward, Ebden immediately gave up on defense and swung its greatsword at Brando. Unfortunately, the young man was already prepared. His move forward was just a trick. When the undead knight moved its hand, Ebden immediately turned around and dodged the attack. However, Ebden wasn't the only one who was tricked. Buga was tricked as well. When Brando moved forward, Ebden was exposed to his sword. Buga was shocked by his opponent's aggressiveness, but he didn't dare to hesitate. He placed both his hands on his greatsword and used the centrifugal force from his waist to change the direction of his attack. His target was Brando's back. What a good whirlwind slash! Brando wasn't surprised at all. He was waiting for this attack. In Bugha's swordsmanship, this was the only attack that could quickly turn around and attack him. Brando was extremely clear about his opponent's attack patterns. He had been planning for Ebden since the beginning, but the real trap was prepared for him. He leaped high into the air. Bugha raised his head in shock. He wasn't a newbie, and when Brando moved, he knew that the young man's plan was on him. However, after changing his direction several times, his center of gravity had already reached a delicate balance point. If he changed his direction slightly, he would fall. In other words, he was completely helpless against Brando's next attack. Not far from him, Ebden was already on the ground, and Terce was just about to get up. The situation was irreversible. Brando drew a beautiful arc in the air. At that moment, he flew over Bugha's head and formed an inverted position with Bugha. The young man's hand was on the hilt of his sword, as if he was about to draw his sword and attack someone. Time froze at that moment. Everyone subconsciously held their breaths. The previous battle was different from the previous one. It wasn't as thrilling as the battle with the Wind Dragon or the Type 4 Hunter, but it was still equally thrilling. The dazzling swordsmanship battle took place in a very short period of time. It was so fast that people couldn't see it clearly, but when they saw the situation clearly in the next moment, it was as if they had seen something. Brando had already turned the tables around and was preparing to kill his opponent. Especially to the youths who didn't understand, this was even more legendary than the stories told by bards in bars. It was filled with a sense of desperation and desperation. However, the plot didn't always develop as expected. Just when Brando thought that victory was within his grasp, he suddenly heard a terrifying explosion from behind him. It was the sound of a sword being swung like a whip, slicing through the air with extreme speed. Brando's scalp went numb. Of course he knew who that was. Of course, he could continue his attack, and he was 90% sure that his sword would pierce through Bugha's throat. But at the same time, he was also very confident that his grandfather would cut him in half with a single slash of his sword. It was obviously not a good deal, and Brando had no choice but to withdraw his sword in the air. He spun his body, and his right hand once again pulled the sword behind his back. The indestructible property of the spatial element saved his life. When his grandfather's whip struck his sword, it let out a teeth-numbing screech. A huge force was transmitted through the sword to his hand, and Brando felt as if his hand was about to break. But fortunately, he wasn't cut in half, and was sent flying far away. Brando rolled a few times in the air before landing. He looked up and saw Bugha had lost his balance after the whirlwind slash, and that towering figure was standing quietly in front of him. Oh! The youths let out a sigh of pity. Strange, Bugha is weaker than the rumors say. Yuta noticed that something was wrong. Scarlet's mind was focused on Brando and she did not hear what he said. But at the same time, the old swordsman on the other side of the arena had the same thought. Why doesn't Tops look that strong? The old man frowned. But in fact their doubts were very easy to answer. At this moment Brando had an answer in his heart. That was because these people only existed in his mind. Other than Ebden, he had never fought with any of them in a life-or-death battle. Without the experience of a life-or-death battle, he naturally wouldn't be able to see the strongest side of their swordsmanship. But even so, the current situation gave Brando a headache. He couldn't help but be disappointed to find that his previous attacks didn't have any effect in the end. Instead, it consumed a lot of energy. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com and read more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 313. After a short but intense battle, the atmosphere in the arena seemed to have changed. Before Brando could get up from the ground to catch his breath, the old man who attacked him earlier, his grandfather, rushed forward. The young man was scared out of his wits. He threw the sword in his left hand forward and retreated without thinking. He did not want to face his grandfather directly. It was not that he had the tradition of respecting the old and loving the young, but this old man was simply too terrifying. But he soon realized that things were not as simple as he thought. Bugha, Turst, and Ebden were no longer in a hurry to attack after they stood up. Instead, they carefully coordinated with his grandfather and began to attack together. The battle seemed to have become long and steady. Brendel quickly realized that ever since his grandfather joined in, the old man had led the three of them to attack. He interrupted their quick attacks and instead slowed down the pace of their attacks. I never thought that a veteran who participated in the November War would lead 3 top-notch swordsmen to attack me. Or should I say it's appropriate? It was as if the old man was born to be a leader, making the others follow his orders. When the battle slowed down, it seemed to be in Brando's favor. But in reality, the young man knew that this slow and steady method of fighting would leave him with no chance of winning. At most he would drag the battle on for a while, but he would eventually run out of stamina and die. Brando felt a headache coming on. Originally, he thought that he would not be able to deal with his grandfather alone. The old man's swordsmanship was as sharp as the one he saw in his dreams. It was impeccable. However, his grandfather was not in a hurry to succeed. Instead, he tried his best to disrupt his attacks and counterattacks. Every time Brando wanted to break through Turst's defense, his grandfather would appear there and chase him back. Moreover, his grandfather would chase after him and retreat if he could not gain the upper hand. But Brando knew that if he did not use his full strength to deal with the old man's attack, what awaited him would not be as simple as retreating. Instead, it was a deadly encirclement. It looked like a simple sword strike, but it hid a boundless killing intent. For this reason, Brando had no choice but to concentrate fully on dealing with the attacks. Sometimes, attacks that did not seem dangerous became extremely dangerous when surrounded by other strong enemies. The old man always seemed to be hiding his intentions very well, so Brando had no choice but to focus 120% on dealing with each of his attacks. Even if it was just a feint, there was no exception. The young man was soon in unbearable pain. If he attacked quickly, he still had a chance. But with such a blunt knife cutting his flesh, it was as if he could only watch himself slowly bleed to death. After several futile attempts to break through the encirclement, Brando's range of movement had been reduced by the 4 experienced swordsmen. If he retreated any further, he would almost become a wall of air. However, the other party did not seem to intend to give him a chance to breathe. Instead, they closed in on him. This time it was Bugha and Turst. Brando was not afraid of this combination, but he knew that his grandfather and Ebden were right behind him, waiting for him to walk right into their trap. This made the young man not dare to use his full strength to counterattack. He could only try his best to parry the attacks that might be fatal. He tried his best to slow down his retreating steps while preserving his strength to guard against Ebden and his grandfather's sudden attacks. This kind of focused battle made Brando suffer. He had to maintain his full concentration at all times. The movement of the air around him, the changes in his opponent's muscles, and even the slightest change in their expressions. Only then could he use his understanding of swordsmanship to understand what each of the 4 swordsmen was going to do next. He had never done this before, and it made him feel extremely uncomfortable. It was as if every cell in his body was groaning, and his head was dizzy. His hand movements seemed to have become subconscious. However, Brando did not realize that he was in such a good state right now. The swordsmanship he had seen in the past, and his understanding of swordsmanship were slowly corroborating each other in this battle. Gradually, the knowledge from the other world became the knowledge of this world. It was as if it was unconscious, but he had already mastered it. 1 slash, 2 slashes, 3 slashes. Brendel blocked Bugha's and Turst's swords at an astonishing speed, while his grandfather and Ebden seized the opportunity to attack. The youths outside the arena gasped in shock. Even Scarlet could not help but cover her mouth. Her eyes were wide open. Brando did not even think about it and used all of his strength. He blocked his grandfather's slash with his sword and used the momentum to retreat. He then used the White Raven swordsmanship to sweep the sand on the ground and repelled Ebden's attack. He then landed on the ground and blocked his grandfather's second slash. Another 3 slashes. All of this happened in a breath's time. Brando realized that he did not have this kind of strength before. He was so shocked that he broke out in cold sweat. After playing the game for so many years, Brando had seen countless swordsmanship, But he knew that the swordsmanship of the two worlds was not the same. One was given by the system while the other was obtained through practice. The degree of mastery was completely different. Just like how Brando knew many swordsmanship stances, attack routes and even attack patterns, but when he tried to use them, he only knew the basics. But the 6 slashes just now were completely different. Those 6 slashes were equivalent to him blocking Buga, Turst, Ebden and his grandfather's attacks in just a few seconds. Shit! Brando was shocked. Because what he did was not a self-created technique, but the flash strike sword art. Not only did he recognize it, even Koden, who was watching from the sidelines, could see that something was wrong. The old man was frowning at first. He did not feel good. Brando's comprehension of swordsmanship was so good that even someone of his age could not help but feel jealous. Even though Buga and Tobuz were not in their best condition, but with their current standards, Koden believed that he would not be able to last more than 2 or 3 rounds. Not to mention the other two. Even though he did not know them, they were not weaklings either. This was a pure confrontation of swordsmanship. But that was not the only surprise the young man gave him. Especially when Brando used the flash strike sword art. Koden could not believe his eyes. That was the ancient swordsmanship that Bahamut passed down to the Flame King Gretel. That was the inheritance of the dragons. This is not the Spirit Seal sword art. It is not the Wind Elf swordsmanship. A voice shouted in his mind. Did this kid not rely on the Spirit Seal? How is that possible? Did Tobuz not tell him about this? But the inheritance is clearly in the hands of that young man. Koden shook his head vigorously and threw these thoughts out of his mind. He immediately realized a new problem. If he did not rely on the Spirit Seal, then how did he reach the Golden Realm? Is this what it means to have an extraordinary talent? While the old man was fighting, Brando's grandfather and Ebden retreated. Turst and Buga once again took turns to attack. The young man could be said to be exhausted, but he could only retreat. The air wall behind him was already very close. My lord, behind you! Yuta saw this and could not help but shout out a warning. Brando split his attention and sensed behind him. Sure enough, he found that he could not retreat any further. But when he looked around, he did not have the ability to break through the encirclement. Perhaps he could trade injuries for injuries, but he could not let his grandfather know his intentions. Otherwise it would become a life for a life. Brando frowned. He felt that it was not realistic to fool the old man. But at this moment he heard someone shouting from outside. Kid! This voice sounded so far away in his drowsy mind, as if it came from the horizon. But Brando still understood. The only one who would call him that was the old guard captain. He shook his head hard. He did not know why the old man wanted to cause trouble for him. Could it be that he wanted to use this opportunity to get rid of him? That would be a huge mistake. Since Brando dared to challenge the old man, he naturally had a way to protect himself. It was just that the old man was distracting him, and the Halrangaya might disappear if he wasn't careful, which made him a little annoyed. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. He did not intend to give up on the sword. But at this moment Koden shouted again. Where's your spirit print, kid? This again. Brando did not know what a spirit print was. He felt that he did not even have the strength to reply. But Koden seemed to know this as well. He immediately shouted inside. Your ring, use your ring. As he shouted, he raised the Wind Empress ring in his hand and pointed. Brendel's brows furrowed. He raised his sword to guard against the 4 swordsmen who were approaching him, and he was puzzled. Ring of the Wind Empress? Does this old man not know that in this arena, all equipment and skills unrelated to swordsmanship will be sealed? Thus, he did not intend to answer. The old man was slightly startled. He seemed to be dissatisfied with Brando's lack of response. But he suddenly thought of something and said, Kid, wait, I'm not telling you to use it. Focus on the ring. It's real. Brando was stunned. He subconsciously turned his head and looked at Koden with a look of surprise. What's real? That was the question in his eyes. That ring isn't fake. Koden jumped up and down. I don't know how you got it, but it's your grandfather's. It's real. He suddenly widened his eyes. Behind you. Brando turned around. His grandfather had taken advantage of his distraction to stab him in the back. Brendel could feel the cold killing intent coming from his opponent's sword. It was as if the Grim Reaper had come to him. Author's note. Let me say something. The main character's equipment and stats are almost done. After the Underground King storyline is over, I'll release him. I plan to update the main character's stats every day. But there's a problem. How do I release the stats? The first method is to update the main character's stats every day. But there's a problem with this method. Students who read later might not be able to see the main character's stats. The solution is to update the main character's stats every day. But the consequence of this is that in the future, the main character's stats will be similar to the updated chapters. Of course, this isn't a big problem, but it'll be troublesome for you to find out. Another way to solve this problem was that after I updated the chapters every day, I would use the free word count method to increase the main character's attributes. There might also be some background content related to the novel. Of course, I'll make a poll for these two solutions. You can choose for yourselves. Finally, the order of yesterday's chapters was reversed. I apologize in advance, but the order has been corrected so you can read it normally. Lastly, I'll ask for this month's monthly votes and next month's guaranteed monthly votes. Chapter 3:14. The feeling of impending death was like falling into an ice cellar. It was so cold that it penetrated his bones. A layer of frost appeared on the surface of his skin, and his whole body froze. Even though his opponent's sword had not reached his body, the coldness of the blade seemed to have penetrated his heart. Brendel felt his heart clench. At that moment, he did not have any other thoughts, but he subconsciously tried his best to avoid this fatal blow. But it was too late. Time seemed to have stopped at that moment, and he felt a slight sting on his back. Brando felt his nerves tense up. He could not help but think, did I fail? But at that moment, a blue light suddenly flashed from his body, and the sound of two swords clashing could be heard. The old man immediately retreated, and the blue light chased after him. The two of them clashed 10 times in an instant. This was the first time that Brando's grandfather was forced to retreat. He retreated to open up the distance between them, and when he looked at his sword, it was already broken in half. This dazzling scene happened in the blink of an eye. Everyone was covering their mouths as they watched Brando fall into a dangerous situation. But in the next moment, the situation was completely reversed. Brando was still in the same position when he was attacked, and when he turned his head, he saw the light blue figure standing between him and his grandfather, or rather, blocking the attack of the 4 people. It was the ghost of a woman with shoulder-length hair. Her right hand was slanted to the ground, and she was holding a slender elven sword. The tip of the sword was still trembling slightly. The soul of the Holy Seal. Coden, who was on the other side of the air wall, looked at the woman. At first he was stunned, but then he became suspicious. Who is this woman? Of course he knew her origin, but this soul of the Holy Seal was not one he was familiar with. Coden's own soul was Windslayer Sola, and Tobuza's soul was Azure Swordsman Grice. He did not expect that the old man's grandson's soul of the Holy Seal was a woman. Although there were a few women among the 24 knights, their swordsmanship was not suitable for men, except for Windslayer Sola. But Sola's main weapon was a bow, and all the descriptions of her appearance were that she had a ponytail and a long cloak. Obviously, this was not the one in front of him. But what surprised him was that this soul of the Holy Seal could actually materialize. What kind of characteristic was this? Although his and Tob's soul imprints could also appear in front of others, as spiritual entities, they could not physically interact with this world. What did he see? He saw that the woman had exchanged 10 swords with Tobuz. He couldn't help but raise his head to look at the arena, wondering if the imprinted spirits were stronger in this half-fantasy space than in the outside world. But this kid's luck isn't too good. He actually picked a soul imprint. Coden was surprised, but at the same time, this thought flashed through his mind, and confirmed that this was indeed the first time Brendel activated a soul imprint. What he found hard to believe was that this young man had already reached this stage without even activating his sealed spirit. If so, then what was the limit of his future achievements? Coden could not comment. "Little guy, this is the second time I've saved you." When the woman spoke, her voice was very beautiful, with a mature and rational tone. She did not turn her head, But her voice alone gave people the impression that she was an extremely beautiful woman with an outstanding temperament. Who are you? Brando was stunned. Ever since he transmigrated, he did not know that he had a third spirit-sealed soul. I'll tell you later, the woman replied. You've improved very quickly, but it's still not enough to deal with these enemies. Let me borrow your body. Borrow your body? Brando's heart skipped a beat when he heard this suggestive sentence. He knew that these spirits, or rather the innate ability of banshees, possessed people. He hurriedly retreated, but the woman waved at him. His body moved forward uncontrollably, allowing the woman's spirit to merge with his body. Don't be afraid. The woman's voice sounded in his mind. Focus on the ring on your finger. You? Brando's eyes widened. Only now did he realize that the woman's spirit might have come from the ring on his finger. He suddenly remembered that Coden had shouted at him outside, telling him that the ring on his finger was the real deal. But the real ring of the Wind Empress? Saint Tossel's divine artifact, the breath of the Wind Empress? How is this possible? Let's not talk about why his grandfather would have such an artifact. Legend has it that the breath of the Wind Empress was a sacred artifact from the wind element. If the mountain of ceasing storms was a mountain peak, then the ring of the Wind Empress would be the most dazzling jewel on the mountain peak. With it, he could control the power of the wind. But what does this have to do with souls? And what does it have to do with this woman? While he was distracted, not far away, his grandfather was repairing the sword in his hand. A layer of faint shadow grew from the broken part of the sword, and then this layer of shadow extended forward, gradually forming the shape of a blade. Then the shadow receded, revealing the bright silver metal blade below. Kid, don't be distracted. When the woman saw this, she immediately reminded him, we can only maintain this state for a short period of time. This is not the correct way to use the Holy Seal. The correct way to use the Holy Seal? Brando was stunned. The Holy Seal was created to pass on its legacy. But now I'm using my own power to forcibly transfer this legacy to you, the woman replied. You'll understand in the future. Brando shook his head. His mind was in a mess. He could not accept all the information that was coming to him, but of course he understood his current situation. After hearing the woman's words, he immediately scanned his hand. The ring of the Wind Empress was still the same ring of the Wind Empress. Ring of the Wind Empress ring, +1 dexterity. Skill, wind bullet, but at this moment, there was a row of small green words. Soul Seal enlightened state. Soul Seal? Brando frowned slightly. What does that mean? He had heard this term from Coden before, but until now, he still did not understand what this so-called Soul Seal was. But at this moment, the young man's eyes twitched slightly. He noticed that at the edge of his vision, there were two small notifications. Possession status, skill connection status. He understood the possession status. All players who were possessed by ghosts would see this notification. It was similar to a debuff notification, to prevent players from not knowing what was happening to them. But the second skill connection status puzzled him. He knew about this status as well. Wizards had a type of spell called ritual spells, which used the power of a magic array to connect the mana pools of many people together, to cast a large-scale spell that one person couldn't cast alone. When wizards entered the ritual, they would receive this notification and be able to use other people's spells. But he was not a wizard, so what did this notification mean? Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he unconsciously opened his skill panel. However, it would have been better if he hadn't seen it. The moment he saw it, he was almost scared out of his wits. Originally, he was a civilian with two main professions, militia and mercenary warrior, elementalist, and a secondary profession scholar. He only had a few skills such as swordsmanship, equestrian, and elemental sensing. But now there were three new professions on the panel. Swordsman, Seal Knight. Swordsman and swordsman were not difficult for Brando to understand. The former was a basic profession of warrior and ranger, and the swordsman was the most common advanced profession of this profession. But as for what Seal Knight was, he had never heard of it. Although there were many professions of players, there were only a few that Brando did not know about. But this was not the most important thing. What really made him widen his eyes were the skills that appeared behind those professions. Even after the most basic swordsman, there were at least 10 types of swordsmanship. What is this? Brando was at a loss for a moment. Of course, he knew where these skills came from, but was that woman so powerful? So many skills meant a lot of practice and even battle experience. In other words, she had to have so many skills and character experience. Brando recalled that he did not have as many skills as this woman when he was level 80 or 90. Of course, this had to do with the fact that the skill trees of players were relatively simple. Very few players were willing to waste their experience on skills that did not add to their main path. Squandering experience like Brando to level up both warrior and elementalist levels was something that only newbies in the game would do. But even so, this was a little too ridiculous. There were probably less than 20 people in Woned in this era who were so powerful. But in other words, the Ring of the Wind Empress was not a product of this era. Then the identity of the woman was obvious. "You are a wind elf?" Brando asked in his mind. "Sure." The woman pressed her finger on her plump lips. Although Brando could not see it, he could feel the scene in his heart. "Don't be distracted, I will tell you later. Your enemy is coming." Her words made Brando suddenly wake up. Sure enough, he saw the 4 people on the field surrounding him. "Do you need my help?" Brando looked at the skills and shook his head. He could not use them before, but once he mastered them, he was confident that he would not be weaker than anyone else. A level 130 warrior, even in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, was one of the strongest. The woman was slightly surprised. "Kid." At this moment, Coden shouted from outside the wall of air. The old man saw the sealed spirit in Brando fusing into one and knew what had happened. He had experienced the same thing when he was young. In fact, at that time his mind was filled with so much information that he almost fainted. However, Brando stood there without moving. His face was calm, but he seemed to be slightly distracted. Coden could not help but admire him. The old man knew that the first time a person's soul fused with a sealed spirit, the pain was not something a normal person could endure. But what he did not know was that Brando already had 2 souls in his body. Secondly, his system had absorbed the explosion of information from the beginning. P.S. Seeing that no one trusts me, I am very sad. I am going to explode. Do you dare to support my broken glass heart? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 315. Kid. Coden patted the air wall. Knowledge and skill were 2 different things. A person could memorize all the starting stances and attack patterns of a swordsmanship, but that was different from years of personal practice. Coden thought that even if Brando understood all the sword styles, it would still be difficult for him to use them. Coden himself had the same experience, but he had gained a lot of experience from years of practice. He thought that with his advice, Brando might be able to defeat those opponents. So he shouted, "Don't worry about those things in your head. I'll tell you how to use them. Whose sword style did you learn?" But what the old man didn't expect was that Brando didn't even care about him. In fact, the young man was a little annoyed. If it wasn't for Coden's interference, he wouldn't have failed. But he understood that Coden was trying to help him, so he didn't mind it too much. But he wouldn't make the same mistake again. First, it wasn't necessary. Second, the enemies were already in front of him. Similarly, Ebden and Buga were at the front, while his grandfather and Terse were at the back. It seemed like these projections were trying to use the same tactic to force him into a corner. That's a good idea. My body is getting heavier and heavier. This is a sign that my stamina is running out. But this time the situation was a little different. Brando thought for a while and picked out a sword style that was most suitable for his current situation. He wasn't unfamiliar with this sword style. He had a friend who was an expert in this sword style. He had also invested a few levels into it, but it didn't fit his main path, so he gave it up. But the mismatch at that time was unexpectedly suitable for this situation. Brendel shook the tip of his sword slightly and entered into a very familiar stance. "Kid." The woman's voice surprised him. It was a sword style that he had never seen before, but he was already familiar with it. "What's wrong?" Brando's heart was as calm as still water as he replied from an outsider's point of view. "Your talent in swordsmanship is really enviable. The only one who can match up to you is probably that guy." The woman sighed. Her soft sigh could soften one's heart. Brando didn't know who she was talking about, but judging from the elf's coldness, It might be the Flame King Gretel. As far as he knew, Guilt had been crowned as a genius when he was young. It must be known that in the era of the War of the Holy Saints, when the stars rose together, this title was not as serious as it was now. His thoughts were erratic, but the tip of his sword pointed at the enemy remained motionless. At this moment, Brando had a clear feeling that he had been split into two. A self that was about to face the enemy, and a self that was calmly thinking about everything. The two selves did not interfere with each other, forming a dynamic balance. It was a delicate balance. It felt as if time had been stretched out, and everything around him had become fine and delicate. The flow of his thoughts had slowed down, and the movements of the people around him had slowed down as well. The enemies in the gladiator arena were slowly moving towards him. The audience's eyes followed their movements. Coden slapped the air wall and shouted at him from the other side of the arena. "Kid!" the old man shouted. "Listen to me, don't try to be brave. No one can master a new swordsmanship from the start." But before the old swordsman could finish his words, his voice stopped abruptly, because he saw Brando suddenly move. The young man only waved the sword in his hand slightly, and in the next moment, he split into four. It was not a clone technique, but Brando's movements were extremely fast. It was as if there were four Brandos attacking his grandfather, Terst, Buga, and Ebden at the same time. Ding 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 ding. For crisp sounds rang out in the next moment. Horizontally and vertically, Brando clashed with each of his four opponents, and all five of them took a step back. This time, not only did their attack not achieve their goal, but it also increased Brando's range of movement. This was the Wind Elf swordsmanship. The old man recognized it. Wind dance, but what he could not believe was that the young man was able to use it just like that. It was as if he had practiced it for years. No, it was not as simple as just practice. The old man was an experienced swordsman, and of course he understood what Brando's swordsmanship meant. Battle experience. Coden's hand froze in midair. If his eyes could pop out of their sockets, they would have fallen to the ground by now. "Oh my God, Martha! What kind of talent is this?" The old man felt a headache coming on, as if his brain was being twisted together. How could there be such an existence in this world? He was not the only one who had this feeling. Brando's four opponents felt it especially. Because their strength was limited to the same level, technique became the key to victory. But now, they realized that the young man's swordsmanship had become erratic. It was a complete change. The four of them retreated, but they continued to attack after a slight pause. They were all famous swordsmen, and naturally understood that the only way to defeat Brando was to continue pressuring him, and not let him have a chance to breathe. This time, the main attacker was Brando's grandfather. He was the strongest of the four, so he naturally had to bear the brunt of the pressure. He placed his sword flat, and the others immediately understood what he meant. Surround and maintain the pressure. It could be said that when the old man did this, he had already given up on waiting for an opportunity to decide the outcome of the battle with a single sword strike. Instead, he had switched to a more secure method that was close to defensive suppression. Although it seemed a little despicable, it was still the best choice. Brando saw this scene and was secretly shocked. He could not help but wonder who his grandfather was. This level of command did not seem like the ability of a veteran. However, with 4 against 1, the side that was more conservative was still the side with more people. Brando's battle had completely shocked everyone outside the arena. Especially in the hearts of the youths, this young lord was probably on par with the legendary god of war. But when the old man placed his sword flat, Brando did the same. However, he did not do so for defense, but for the first stance of a swordsmanship. The Tejas assault swordsmanship. When Brando found this swordsmanship in the woman's skill list, he was so surprised that the sword in his hand trembled slightly. Compared to Erwin's military swordsmanship, this was the swordsmanship he was most familiar with as a level 130 warrior. It was also the swordsmanship he used the most. This swordsmanship was later learned by the Northerners and gradually spread. After a few modifications, it was given a new name, the Church's Knight Nation's assault swordsmanship. Brando placed his sword flat and thought to himself, "Then I'll show you what swordsmanship is." At that moment, his grandfather was clearly the one in front, but Terst was shocked to see that the first person Brando went for was him. How did he go around him? That was the question everyone had in mind at that moment. Even the white-haired old man turned around in shock, but all he saw was Brando plunging his sword into Terst's throat. "What are you doing?" The old man was stunned. He couldn't help but ask Buga and Ebden with his eyes. Even if Brando went around him, how did Brando manage to kill Terst so easily? However, Buga and Terst only replied with the same innocent look. It was too fast. Before they could react, Brando had already flicked away Terst's sword and pierced the young Viscount's throat. "Little one," the woman looked at the scene with surprise. "That's not my swordsmanship. I modified it," Brando boasted shamelessly. His sword didn't slow down as he replied. Brando moved forward, and Ebden and Buga were like children blocking his path. Even the swordsmanship they were so proud of was like a child's play. The young man's attack was as fast as a dragon, and he broke through the encirclement formed by his grandfather and the two swordsmen in a single turn. When Buga and Ebden tried to turn around to look for Brando, the old man raised an eyebrow and tried to block Brando's attack from behind. However, he immediately realized that it was a trap. Because Brando's sword had split into three, the old man immediately retreated and swung his sword left and right to deflect Brando's attacks. This time it was Brando's turn to be shocked. He looked at his grandfather in disbelief. Even though he didn't have the support of his body and could only display 10% or 20% of his swordsmanship, everyone here was the same. No one was better than the other. The swordsmanship that his grandfather used to block him was at least at level 60. Brando's jaw dropped. Did that mean his grandfather was an elemental awakener? How was that possible? Thinking about it, he felt that this assumption was too absurd. Would a powerhouse with elemental awakening run to a border province to run a small mill? It wasn't that there was no such thing as a hidden expert, but in Brando's memory, his grandfather had always been a veteran of the November War. That was all. He looked at the old man in front of him and the old man looked back at him. Suddenly, his grandfather's expression changed. "Don't." This was the first time Brando's grandfather's projection spoke because he saw Buga preparing to ambush the young man from behind. Of course, he didn't want to warn Brando. Instead, he wanted to remind him that he was a rapier grandmaster. Unfortunately, it was too late. Buga and Brando passed by each other. To be exact, Buga's headless corpse passed by Brando. No one saw how Brando attacked. "It's just a small trick." The young man looked at his grandfather and replied, "Tis, do you think there will be more after today? If you guess correctly, please vote. If you don't, please vote more." That's it. Speaking of which, it seems like there are a lot of students writing doujinshi. If there are students who have written doujinshi, please send them to 179096463@QQ.com. I'll organize them and post them so that all the loving students can share them. Chapter 316. It was 1 against 2, and the two silent corpses in the arena seemed to indicate who was the victor. As expected, Brando quickly used the same trick to kill Ebden. Brando felt a little guilty for killing the White Knight twice. No matter how he looked at it, it was too tragic. However, the White Knight did not feel that way. Its corpse turned into a puff of black smoke and disappeared from the arena. This proved that the undead knight was a part of the arena before it was projected and never existed. The White Knight in history had already died in the mountains outside Fortress Reden. Just like the countless nameless corpses in this war. The old man in front of him was the same. Brando looked at his grandfather and raised his sword. The old man nodded and did the same. It was Erwin's military swordsmanship. The grandfather and grandson were going to use this swordsmanship that they were both familiar with to decide the victor. What followed was an intense battle. Brando never thought that his grandfather would be this powerful. Of course, if he knew that Coden did not think that this old man was at his peak, he would probably reevaluate his grandfather. Now he was reevaluating this old man. This old man was a veteran of the November War, who held the Candlelight Medal. However, if that was all, perhaps he was only slightly stronger than Captain Martin, but not by much. But at this moment, the strength displayed by this old man had clearly far exceeded this realm. Who is he? Brendel did not know the answer. He took a step back and dodged the old man's sword. Then he turned around and stabbed his sword into the old man's chest with a simple stab. The old man was stunned. He did not expect to fail like this, but in the end, he raised his head and looked at Brendel. "Well done, young man," he said. Then, He turned into black smoke and disappeared from the arena. Brando knew that it was the projection in his heart talking to him. Perhaps the old man had said the same thing to Brando in the past. But the details of this life had long been buried under the dust of memory. Brando could only recall the memory of the past through the voice in the wind. He maintained the posture of holding the sword with one hand and stabbing forward for a moment before he finally came to his senses. The young man shook his head and calmly returned to the center of the field. The wall of air around him disappeared in an instant, and Coden almost fell to the ground. Fortunately, he did not forget about his own strength. He pushed himself up with one hand on the ground. The old swordsman cursed in his heart, but he forgot to ask Brando about his grandfather and the spirit seal. Looks like it's not a coincidence that you can wake me up. Brando was silent for a while. The woman's voice sounded in his heart again. It seems that you can wake me up. It's not a coincidence, little guy. Your talent in swordsmanship can't be described as extraordinary. The woman's voice made Brando's ears itch. It was as if he wanted her to say more. Now can you tell me who you are? Brando asked. My name is Orthless. The woman left his body and reappeared in front of him in the form of a ghost. This was the first time he saw the woman's appearance. Her wavy black hair was draped over her shoulders, but it was not messy. Instead, it had a neat and concise power. Her eyes were the unique purple blue of the wind elves, but they were much deeper than the average person's eyes. His first impression of her was that she was a dignified and serious person, but this hint of devilishness made her look more mature than she actually was. She had a long purplish-black eyeshadow, and he could not help but be slightly taken aback. His first impression of her was that she was a dignified and serious person, but this hint of devilishness made her look even more mature. He felt his breath catch in his throat. In the era of the War of the Holy Saints, there were indeed records of mist elves who liked to use facial tattoos to decorate themselves. But this was the first time Brando saw one that was so perfect. Wait, you are one of the 24 knights. Then he reacted and immediately interrupted her. He had already guessed that she was a heroic spirit from the era of the War of the Holy Saints. But the 24 knights of Saint All the Wind Empress were different. The 24 knights who followed Saint All the Wind Empress were in fact the most outstanding heroes of the elven race. Of course, at that time they were not called Wind Elves but the Mist Elves, a race that was as famous as the Silver Elves. But these heroes had already fallen in the battle with the Dark Dragon. The last one to sacrifice was the Blade Knight, Orthless. She was also the founder of this profession. That was when the forces of justice were about to win, and everyone saw the light at the end of the tunnel. In the Battle of the Grey Swamp, the youngest of the 24 knights, as well as the favorite disciple of Holy Archer Sonia, died in her own position in order to protect the Flame King's attack. In human age, she was only 16 years old. But Brando could not help but feel doubtful when he saw this woman who was holding a sword with one hand and had an outstanding temperament. Could it be that after becoming a heroic spirit, one's age would increase? Otherwise, how could she become so much more mature? Don't interrupt, little one. Orthless put her finger to her lips with a slight smile in her eyes. Yes, I am that Orthless. But you can just call me Kaya, that's my nickname. I thought. Brando looked at the woman curiously. I didn't think that you didn't disappear, but became heroic spirits instead. Heroic spirits could not be created out of thin air, unless it was in a place like the Sanctum that had some of the attributes of the heroic spirit palace. For example, the Crimson Palace of the Holy Cathedral of Fire that nurtured the flame-beloved knight. But it was rare for a ring to have the ability of a sanctum. This only meant that the Ring of the Wind Empress was worthy of being called a divine artifact. He paused for a moment and suddenly thought of something. What's a sealed spirit? Orthless nodded. Sealed spirit is the abbreviation for the soul of the Holy Seal. The Holy Seal is the Holy Seal of the Wind Empress. There are also the Holy Seal of Fire and the Holy Seal of the Earth. In our era, powerful souls are extremely precious. These unyielding and pure souls are also the best soldiers to fight against the Dark Dragon. The heroic spirit army? Brando tried to ask. Orthless nodded again. It doesn't matter if it's the Wind Empress or the Flame King. The power of the Holy Seal is actually the power of inheritance. This power comes from the dragon race. It's the same for the wise ones themselves. She looked at Brando. That was a cruel war. You'll understand if you experience it yourself. Brando naturally understood the cruelty of the War of the Holy Saints. He even thought of the Silver Elves' souls in the Chablis Mountains. They had also become heroic spirits and continued to fight against the Dark Dragon, even under Martha's orders. However, he was curious. This heroic spirit army was not mentioned in most of the history books. It was not even Orthless who told him about it. He had never even heard of it. Where did they go after that? Brando suddenly thought of a possibility. After the war, the 100 races established their own kingdoms. What happened to these heroic spirits? Did they return to the embrace of Mother Earth? The youth thought that the possibility of this was very small. Based on the Silver Elves' heroic spirits in Chablis, most of them might still be in this world. Orthless shook her head as expected. I don't know about that. Brando looked at her. This answer was not out of his expectations. Orthless sacrificed herself on the battlefield before the war ended, so it was normal for her not to know what happened after that. However, he did not care too much about this matter at the moment. It was already difficult for him to gain a foothold in the Erewhon Empire, so he did not have the time to care about these vague historical issues. Orthless did not seem to want to continue on this topic, so she continued. The so-called Soul Seal is because the power of inheritance is indestructible. The Wind Empress divided the divine ring into 24 subrings, and placed each of our souls into the subrings. We signed a contract with Lady Martha, and the purpose of our existence is to nurture the next generation of heroes for the forces of justice. For example, you and other youths with talents like you. But the war is already over, Brando replied. Besides, won't you regret being trapped in the ring forever? We have no choice. Orthless replied. If there are no sacrifices, the Dark Dragon will never be defeated. As for the latter, in different eras, who can tell when the fire of war will be extinguished? We can only do our best to ensure the continuation of our civilization. Brando was silent. Compared to the nobles of this era, the sages of the War of the Holy Saints could indeed be called sages. However, this seemed to be a common problem of intelligent races. Once life was easy, civilization would become lazy and hate work. Then, Lady Orthless, what can you do? Will you let me use your skills like before? I'm afraid not. Orthless shook her head. That's just a temporary measure. I can only teach you what I know. It's just a process of accumulation over time. It's impossible to reach the sky in a single step, little one. Brendel looked at her, and her explanation was more acceptable to him. In other words, the so-called power of the soul of the Holy Seal was to develop the talent of a person with potential as much as possible. With these heroic spirits from the War of the Holy Saints as their teachers, the speed of growth of a person with talent was self-evident. But in the end, one still had to rely on oneself. Brando thought that his grandfather and Coden had their own Holy Seal, but now it seemed that the difference between their achievements was like heaven and earth. Although Coden was a mid-gold rank swordsman, he was only average if the power of the Holy Seal was taken into account. He thought for a moment and asked his last question. Last question, Lady Orthless, you said that this was the second time you saved me. What did that mean? Orthless looked at him and smiled. Have you forgotten about the fire in Bucci, little one? Brando was stunned for a moment, but then he understood. He stared at her with wide eyes. He could not help but feel a burst of fear. If he did not find the ring of the Wind Empress, he might have died in the red pine forest behind his ancestral home. P.S. I've finally finished writing. To fall heroically, this is the fate of a warrior. To be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading.